A Crown for the Cursed. Fae Crown, Book 2. Written by Joy Lewis. Narrated by Grace Noble. Music by Roman Smith. Chapter 1. Before the assassin's first arrow lodged deep inside her heart, Anova's eyes flew open. She shouldn't have been able to know that it was coming, but she did. She leapt to her feet as the arrow's tip dug into the floorboards on which she'd been sleeping. The long, empty manor creaked with her movements. That was one reason why she'd chosen this place as shelter. Unlike well-maintained Fae structures, this one made noises. Well, there was another reason she'd chosen this manor. Anova closed herself off to the memory. She had to keep her head. The assassins swung to the floor from the rafters. The Fae wore black clothing that hid them well in the shadows, concealing even their face. This one was better than many of the others that had come for her. The fact that this Fae had even found her was enough proof. But after 3 days of no sleep, Anova had slipped up. Another arrow sailed above her head as she ducked out of its path, and her fingers dug into the fireplace poker that was her only weapon. "Leave me alone or aim better," she said between clenched teeth. Anova didn't allow herself to think on the possibility that the misses had been intentional, that this assassin's aim wasn't to kill her, but to take her. Like all Fae, her assassin was inhumanly fast. They lodged themselves further in the shadows, and Anova lost the light to see by when they knocked their next arrow. Her heart clanged in her chest like a bell in a tower. How could she hope to dodge arrows she couldn't even see? When they were faster and stronger from the start, how could she outmatch a Fae on equal ground? His voice filled the silence inside her. Fae, human, animal, it doesn't matter. All that matters is who has more to lose. Who can't lose. But the problem was, she wasn't sure that she had much to lose anymore. "Use their position against them," sang another voice in her head. She had experience fighting against Fae now, and their worst weaknesses were their ego and sense of superiority over humans. They all thought humans weak just because they didn't have their reflexes or moon magic. Well, there was more to a fight than that. Why not play into her attacker's misconceptions? Anova darted to the side as if she were going to take cover behind the wide bed shoved against a wall. Instead, she sprinted for the shadows where her Fae assassin was. 2 arrows had already stuck into the soft bed by the time her foe realized their mistake. The only way she could hope to best this Fae would be to fight close. Trying to flee the room would likely earn her an arrow in the spine. Anova raised the metal poker above her head for a heavy strike. It left her open, but archers were generally useless at this distance. The Fae let out a hiss as they dropped and rolled on the floor. Anova followed like a shadow, her heart swelling with the desire for something that had been crafted for use as a weapon. How much easier crossing the boundary forests would be if she had a bow and some arrows. Anova held the poker with both hands as she rushed forward. It was an all-or-nothing strike that would have been foolish to attempt under ordinary circumstances. But that was what made the attack so brilliant. To her satisfaction, the Fae assassin's eyes visibly widened. They were already on their feet again, and it was too late to move out of the way enough to dodge her wide strike. The assassin's hands clamped around the metal and steered it narrowly past where it should have pierced their insides. But by doing so, they were brought closer than Anova would have liked. The dim light leaking through the room's curtained window fell on her assassin's face. It was one she'd seen before. "Did you already have a death wish?" the Fae whispered into Anova's face. Her eyes were beautiful and glittering like jewels. Like the last time she'd seen this Fae, her hair had been styled and pinned tight to her head. Black clothes consumed her small frame. It was the Fae from the quarter moon fate, The same one who had nearly been executed by the king's guards for having so-called weapons, her mother's hairpins. The same one who Anova had saved from that fate. Except she hadn't anticipated that she truly was an assassin after the blood crown. Anova's stomach turned, and she yanked the cold metal back. I should have let you die. Why had she been such a bleeding heart? She knew better when it came to the Fae. But not all Fae are like this. Something tangled in Anova's throat. She'd hardly allowed herself to think on him since the worst had happened. A pain sparked at her temples. She was reminded against her will of the damned Fae artifact that sat on top of her head. Anova ached to grab it and throw it at the assassin's feet. But, as she'd discovered, she couldn't take it off. Not without consequences. I should have killed more of you when I had the chance, Anova added. She didn't like the bite to her tone, but maybe if she killed this one for good, or at least scared her off, the others would learn not to pursue her anymore. The Fae assassin jerked out of striking distance, her hands already knocking another arrow. Your hate taints you, she said to Anova. You think it makes you strong, but it makes you weak. Anova's teeth gritted together. What did this Fae know of hate? She would show her the meaning of it. It was time to end this. The longer she entertained this Fae, the more likely the others would find her too. Anova brought herself low and swung wide with the metal for an immobilizing blow. Pain streaked through her shoulder as an arrow tore past her, taking some of her skin with it. At once, the Fae's legs were no longer in the path of her weapon. Anova cursed under her breath as she realized something. That hadn't been a killing hit. None of them had. The Fae assassin was trying to capture her alive, not kill her. She lurched back, one palm tight against the wound. Who hired you? Anova spat. Pain danced along her nerves. She needed to get out of here. The Fae didn't respond except for a slight narrowing of her eyes. Anova's blood rushed through her faster. Anova needed to outwit her further. Her opponent fired several arrows in succession at her feet, and each time, Anova managed to barely dodge each piercing blow. Careful! It wouldn't do to damage the fragile parcel you were paid by your master to retrieve, Anova said. I have no master, the assassin snarled back as she notched another one. Liar, Anova hissed. She could spot one of her own with ease. She angled the widest part of the fireplace poker in front of her body to deflect her next arrow. As she'd predicted, it had been aimed at somewhere non-lethal, and she blocked it easily. Anova breathed through her nose. What she needed to do now would break her heart, but it needed to be done. With a clear swing to the Fae's midsection, Anova heaved herself forward. The Fae pivoted to protect herself from the poker, but Anova redirected her momentum at the same time. The other side of the poker slashed through the intricately carved wood of the bow, smashing it to pieces. Anova resisted the temptation to drive the weapon through her heart for a fatal blow, and her fireplace poker hovered over the spot in a clear threat as Anova shoved her down. Now, Anova breathed. You're going to tell me what I want to know. The Fae huffed, her eyes hard as she stared up at Anova. Her knee dug into the Fae's chest where she'd gotten her on the ground. But first, she continued, you're going to tell me who hired you. Anova had done it. She was drunk on her success. She'd beaten one of them, not for the first time, but it was as sweet as if it was. It was when her thoughts turned to him that it happened. Silver flashed in the dim light, and the Fae assassin kicked away the poker as Anova recoiled from the hidden blade. She darted out of range of her strike, her chest heaving. I should have expected that. I should have. Anova's breath froze in her chest. Where did you get that knife? Surrender, the Fae said, and I won't hurt you. Anova couldn't even laugh at the lie. Her eyes didn't leave the knife. It was one she'd seen many times before, as well as its sister. It was one of Leander's. She should have left by now. She should have run for the door now that her foe was fighting close. She should have run from the place and not looked back. Instead, Anova dodged the edge of the knife while staying within arm's reach of her opponent. The wound along her arm throbbed with fresh blood flow. Where did you get it? Anova repeated. Her hand darted for the Fae's wrist, but she was too fast for Anova. She cursed under her breath. Her opponent didn't give an answer. Perhaps there was none. And perhaps she'd already killed someone close to her. The blood slogged through her veins. What if she had hurt him? It hit her all at once. Anova didn't move fast enough to dodge the Fae's strike. The pain seared into the skin of her cheek. There was a reason this Fae had found her here when others hadn't. There was a reason she was using his knife. It can't be. No. He wouldn't. But she had to know. Anova shoved her palm against her new cut. Though it was shallow, more blood loss wouldn't help her. It was time for a gamble. Whatever Wolfsbane has promised you, he lied. Anova saw in her eyes what she'd feared to see. Recognition. You babble like the moon-mad human, the assassin said through her teeth, but it was too late. Anova had seen the evidence. The answer bubbled in her belly like vomit. It was no coincidence she'd been found here, in this manor where Leander had found her before. It had been on the night that he'd told her who he truly was. It was no coincidence this Fae was using one of Leander's weapons. He'd known to look for her here. He was bent on destroying the Fae artifact linked with her life. And the only way to do that was to kill Anova. Chapter 2. Anova's heart raged in her chest like it could escape. That couldn't be true, could it? He hadn't sent this Fae after her. He couldn't have. But his goal had always been to destroy the Blood Crown. At one point, Leander had planned to sacrifice his own life in order to ensure its destruction. It was something she'd tried not to think about in the days since she'd woken up with the Fae artifact attached to her head. But she couldn't avoid it any longer. As long as she breathed, Leander couldn't get what he wanted. And he wanted that more than anything. She'd been a fool to think otherwise. But, a fragile part of her argued, he wouldn't wish that. He would find another way. Anova bit into her tongue. She had to keep it together. Her foe hadn't relented. In fact, her attacks had only quickened. The edge of Leander's knife flashed in the light, each one a deadly reminder of him. As her breaths grew shallower, Anova kept moving. It was her only hope to prevent more attacks from landing, but her sleepless body could only cooperate with her wishes for so long. Pain flared at her temples again, nearly blinding her. She had to get out of here, now. I can't outmaneuver my enemy, nor can I outrun her. But she had other talents. Keeping out of reach of her foe's blade stole most of her breath, so Anova spoke in gasps. Why are you working for him? If he promised you the crown, you must know by now that's a lie. But the Fae didn't flinch. She moved out of the way of Anova's kick to her shins and countered with a flurry of slashes. Either use your words for your surrender, or don't, the Fae said. If I must drag you from here unconscious, I don't mind. Anova couldn't give up. Cheating was what she did best. Spears of pain drove into her head, eclipsing the pinpricks of pain along her cheek and arm. Do all your kind have such little honor? She bit out. A life debt must mean more to a mongrel. This, the Fae had no response for. Anova's heart pumped blood to her wounds faster. While dodging, Anova lurched to the floor and grabbed the poker, only for her opponent to use her lapse in focus as a chance to stab her with Leander's knife. It didn't hit. Narrowly, Anova had blocked the strike to her thigh with the metal rod. In the same instant, the edge of the long knife splintered from the blade and soared through the air until it stuck into the wall behind them. Her assassin snarled at the sight, and Anova couldn't believe her luck. All that was left of it was a stump of the blade. She'd won. She'd disarmed her assassin. Twice. Time to go. Anova turned to run, but a whistling sound chased her. Her heart was in her throat, but she knew if she didn't escape now, she wouldn't. She gave in and looked. Seconds before it tore into her calf came the largest shard of the knife that had broken from it. Her assassin had flung it like a throwing knife at her legs. Even though she dodged it, Anova hit the floor like a sack of potatoes to evade it. Her body bruised against the hard surface. Quicker than a flame's tongue, her opponent had the rest of the knife stump at her throat. Anova released the fire poker. "It's over," the Fae said. Like hell it was. There had to be something she could do. All Anova needed was to create a break, an opening. It only had to be enough for her to flee. What could be compelling enough for even one of the Fae to ignore a life debt? There was little question that Anova had saved her life that day, and they both knew it. Did the Fae opposite her have so little sense of morality? Though she was a poor judge of it herself, she didn't think that was entirely the case. Pain flickered through her brain like a hungry flame. The words were out of her mouth before she could stop them. "You don't care about the crown," Anova blinked. "It's her you care about." She remembered the words she'd overheard this assassin speak in the hall during the fete. "They're hair accessories." "And you expect us to believe that?" the guards had said. "They were my mother's." Her mother, Anova repeated in her mind. It was all she knew about this Fae. Other than that, she was an assassin. It was enough. Her opponent's face froze for precious seconds. Anova didn't pause to reflect or even to take the fire poker with her. She slid from her grasp and ran. Anova discovered from the Fae's belongings and the horse which she'd hidden outside the abandoned manor that her name was Liren. Liren's horse was a seasoned mare that was faster than she could have hoped. Anova dumped most of the rest of Liren's belongings. She narrowed her gaze on the forests looming before her. There hadn't been any weapons left behind in the Fae's pack, which left her back to where she'd started. No way to defend herself other than with her own nails and teeth. As she raced under the ever-present canopy of the boundary forests, the shadows followed her. Now that she was properly alone again, she could lose the pretense of stability she'd donned in front of Liren. Anova allowed a deranged laugh to escape her lips. The only one she'd ever come close to trusting in this warped land was trying to hunt her down. How had her life come to this? She needed to remove the blood crown. Too bad everything in Fae wanted to kill her for it first. Anova pressed herself tighter against the mare as the forests rushed past them. She had exactly one true ally left. One who she could be sure wanted her alive more than he wanted anything to do with a Fae artifact. Juris. The closer she edged to the boundary, the more her pulse throbbed. Getting anywhere near Urbess also meant coming dangerously close to Hinterfell. And the only way she could stand Hinterfell was if she was on the important end of a sharp weapon. Something sparked in the base of her skull. Don't worry. I'll be ready for you this time. This time, she would free Juris and herself from the wretched woman permanently. She couldn't afford to ignore Hinterfell's threat to make both of them indentured to her and the brothel she ran. Anova slowed her horse. They were closing on the border. The magic of Fae clung to her skin as if begging her to backtrack. She ignored it. After making certain no one had followed her this time, she dismounted. The birds were quiet here, and the gnats that had dressed the air through most of the boundary forests were gone. Anova started to walk, her heart in her throat. A buzzing erupted in her head. It grew louder with each step. She held her breath. She'd barely dared to hope, but there could be no denying the possibility any longer. The crown was reacting to the barrier. She felt drunk on the knowledge. Humans were never meant to wear the blood crown. Once I leave the magic of Fae, it should dissolve all ties I have to it. But as she took her next step to pass the invisible barrier, something held her in place. Anova jerked back, her heart racing. Her eyes darted everywhere, though there was nothing before her except the empty forest. She extended one hand before her. Just as some force had repelled her body, something intangible stopped her palm. A flurry of noises broke behind her, and she twisted so her back was to the barrier. An army of Fae emerged from all sides of the forest on the Fae side. She cursed out loud. In her inattentiveness, they'd surrounded her. She shouldn't have stopped to sleep at all. And in the middle of them all was the Fae she least wished to see. As he stepped forward, a coat of gold and black enveloping him and shrouding him further in the gloom, the Fae flooding the area started to lower themselves. They were bowing to him. His violet-black eyes glimmered in the darkness with a dangerous wickedness. "Anova, my dear." Hellmyr paused as if savoring the sound of her name on the air. After a moment, a devilish grin spread across his face. "How I've been looking for you." Chapter 3. "I was hoping you'd come back to admire your work," Hellmyr continued, not bothering to gesture to the Fae behind him that they could rise from their bows. Anova watched, waiting for comprehension to arrive. Fae had been without a ruler for only a few weeks. He'd seized power already. Even without a blood crown, there could be no mistake. Hellmyr was the new Fae king. He hadn't even needed it. Towards the trees, one Fae remained standing. Anova's eyes adjusted to the gloom at the edges of the clearing, and she recognized another face. Litharia was draped in robes similar to her son's coat, and jewels tipped her ears which caught on the limited light. She watched this scene with what appeared to be an assumed indifference. Anova's stomach tightened. Her own actions had made this possible, at least in part. Hellmyr's words registered in Anova's brain, and she jerked her head back to where he stood, pacing the edge of his army. "My work?" she said. She'd slipped up. She could see it in Hellmyr's face, the barely noticeable crease between his eyebrows. He'd figured something out. "He thinks I control the crown, and thus made the barrier, rather than the other way around," Anova realized. Well, he assumed so until I proved otherwise. Anova's teeth grinded together. She needed to be better than this to get out of here. She was tired of running, but there was little choice before her. She was no match for an army of Fae. But first, she needed some information, and something told her that Hellmyr wouldn't hold back the truth. "Where's Leander?" she asked. Hellmyr stopped and let out an abrupt laugh. "No idea, I'm afraid. Although..." He paused and stepped forward, his strange grackle eyes drinking in the blackness around them. "I'm glad you got rid of him." He took another step towards her as he continued talking. There's something I need to discuss with you, and it's much easier without him. I'll kill you if you get any closer. Anova feared her heart thundered too loudly for the threat. She didn't know how she'd make it happen, but she swore to herself then that she'd try. I hoped you'd say that. Hellmyr didn't break eye contact with her as he held out his hand behind him. One of his Fey soldiers rose to his feet and gave him 2 swords. With his hands full of weapons, his eyes glimmered. I've heard you're quite the duelist, Hellmyr said. Show me. He kicked one of the blades to her. Her mind hadn't stopped buzzing. How was she going to get out of this? She couldn't fight them all. Maybe I don't have to, she considered as she bent to pick up the Fey-made silver. She didn't take her eyes off him either. If this Fey boy wanted to play, then so be it. She attached the sheath to a belt at her waist. No matter what she did here, she intended to keep his weapon. Anova suppressed the tremors in her hands when she gripped the hilt of the sword. It looked like it had been carved from ice, and a chunk of a white gemstone had been planted in the center of the hilt. The balance was better than she could have wanted. She was out of practice, but it wouldn't do to let him know that. They circled each other like predatory birds. She kept her weapon low, aware of all the eyes on them. What do you want? Anova said. You'll have to be more specific. Hellmyr revealed his teeth. There's a lot. Enough of this. She rushed forward, aiming for the most carnage with a stab to his intestines. His response was lightning fast, his blade grinding against hers as he leaned into the block. What do you want from me? She managed. I think you're aware. His face was too close, and his grackle eyes devoured her. She was. When they broke apart, Anova lurched several steps backward. Hellmyr was not out of practice. Her blood thundered through her. This was just a demonstration for his Fey army, a showing of his strength and power against the weak human who had gotten her hands on their most valued artifact. Anova parried his flurry of attacks, and her breath came shorter with each second. Malice coated her words. If you're going to kill me for the blood crown, why don't you just do it already? He was too good. Let me at you, you coward. But he wasn't hurting her. Interesting. Hellmyr's eyes glimmered behind his sword. Because I'd rather have you as my queen. Anova lost her footing and nearly fell on her face. That time when she'd been drugged by the High King and Hellmyr had told her that for the first time, she hadn't believed it. But now, it was easy to see why he'd want that. He didn't want her. He wanted the crown. Or you'll kill me, Anova supplied. Her eyes narrowed. It was clearly the reason for the duel. Isn't that right? Don't lie. You're not providing a choice. Either way, he got the power of the crown. Hellmyr gave a half shrug, though he didn't move his gaze. My darling, you can refuse, but you're still coming with me. For barely a few seconds, his eyes flickered from her face someplace else. He was looking at her arm and cheek, she realized. Her wounds. I won't allow you to leave me only to be stabbed by the nearest goblin that lives under a tree trunk, he said. Not as you are now, at least. Her lower jaw felt like it came unhinged from the rest of her skull. Her cheeks burned. Why pretend to care? She wouldn't be swindled into thinking that. Anova readied her next attack. It was time to end things. But he didn't stop talking. He liked the sound of his voice too much. We'll rule, Anova. Together. Anova stopped. She let herself envision it, if only for a moment. A world to rule over. All the power between them. But she wanted nothing to do with Faye anymore, and that included the damned thing on her head, and the cruel beings that filled its borders. Anova grinned a saccharine smile at him. No. She moved, faster than she let on that she could do, and aimed for his heart. The strike was too close for him to defend against cleanly. Hellmyr moved like a demon, and metal cried against metal. Her sword shattered to pieces. Fragments rained on the ground at their feet. Her arm holding the broken hilt went slack. As much as I've enjoyed this, the game is over, Anova. He looked like he hadn't before, like a king over warriors. His expression was tight, and shadows had fallen over his face. Her stomach flipped. He snapped his fingers, and his army rose to their feet and came forward several steps. No, she wouldn't let this happen. She couldn't let them take her. No matter what he said, they were going to use her or kill her. With such a powerful artifact connected to her blood, those were the only options. A new idea sparked in Anova's brain. A dangerous, foolhardy one. But it had to work. She could use her assassin's tactics. All she needed was something sharp enough to cut through a throat. Night would soon come. She needed to do it now before they had access to their magic. Anova raised her arm that held the hilt of the broken sword. In its center was the jaggedly sharp remainder of its blade. It was as clean as the edge of broken glass. Perfect. Anova held the shard at her throat. Keep them away, or else I'll destroy it. The eyes of all the Fae moved to her. They were attracted to it despite themselves. He was right. Every stump goblin would kill for the power of the crown. They couldn't let it be destroyed before their eyes, or so she hoped. None of them moved except for Hellmyr. His lips were tight, and his eyes were hard. Don't. This was her ticket out. Their king. She stared back at him. Come here and turn around, and drop your weapons. He did as she commanded, pausing only a moment to stare back at her before turning. She felt cold. Don't move, or else, she threatened. Who was faster didn't matter now. Anova pressed her front against Hellmyr's back. His raven hair engulfed her vision. She buried the thoughts of how his body felt against hers. All Fae were like this, she reminded herself. Too pretty for their own good. Across the wide gulf of bodies between them, she locked eyes with Lotharia. The mask had slipped. It was like staring into the eyes of a wolf. Anova almost lost her nerve then. No, she had to get out of here. She had to find a way to destroy the crown. Anova started to walk some steps backward, aware that her heart must have been louder than a drum to the new Fae King. Do I make you nervous? He whispered. She should have ignored that. It was a daft question. But there was something about him that made her lose control of her mouth. Hostages don't normally talk unless to plead. The trees consumed them, and the shadows started to bathe them in their shroud. Before they were out of sight of his army, he commanded to them. Don't move. Don't come after me. And then, a few steps later, they were alone. Her pulse raced even faster. This was the end of her plan. He shifted in front of her, moving his head so he could glance at her halfway. His lids were low. Is this how you would keep your Fae husband? At knife point? On a leash? Her face was on fire. She suppressed the thoughts of it as well as she could. I'm not marrying you. The fire spread to her blood. He'd once wanted to hunt her down for sport. Ever. His expression sobered. A human queen and her Fae king. We would be unstoppable. Anova moved so her mouth hovered over his ear. "You will never catch me alive." "I won't have to," he murmured. "You'll come to me at Eastwoe Palace." Anova pulled back from him and ran, clinging to the broken piece of sword. Chapter 4. When Anova woke up, she was stiff as a board. Brief surprise flickered through her. She hadn't been attacked in the night. Even more surprising was that she'd gotten away from Hellmyr. She rolled from under the brush and leaves she'd used as cover while sleeping. A glance skywards revealed a sun bright and high. Has it been hours or days? She supposed it didn't matter. After escaping Hellmyr's army, she hadn't stopped to sleep for a day and a half. Anova's eyes narrowed when she glimpsed her nose. Something dark had dripped along the side of it. When she touched it, her fingers came away red. She was bleeding. Anova jumped to her feet and shoved her broken sword in her belt. Her fingers felt for the wound when she realized. It wasn't just a little blood. Her hands trembled and she found the pond a few paces away that she'd drunk from before her slumber. In her reflection, she saw rivers of blood falling from around the crown. Her fingers could find no ridges digging into her skin, yet several cuts had formed along her head. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She dunked her head into the water, tinting it pink. She needed to stop the bleeding. Anova tore the sleeve of her shirt off and wrapped it around the wounds she found. She slumped against a tree as she pressed tight to the spot where her blood leaked the most. There were too many reasons to number why she needed to rid herself of the Fey crown. She didn't need another one. Her vision doubled, and she took several deep breaths. The sun crept overhead. After several minutes, Anova stood slowly. She needed to remove it. Destroy it, preferably. Now. But how? The first method was most obvious, and she'd tried it before without success. I'll do it this time, no matter what. She gritted her teeth. It was her or the crown, and she'd been through worse. Anova walked some distance to a wide clearing in the woods she'd slept in. For several minutes, she ensured no one was hiding in the bushes watching her. There'd been too much of that recently. Anova stood in the clearing's center and removed the crown from her head. She placed the gleaming black object on the grass. Here, it looked innocuous. How could such a thing cause so much bloodshed? It didn't look like the bearer of a curse. As soon as it left her head, the pain at her temples lessened. She breathed. She entertained the thought that she could even leave it and come back to destroy it. But at least this part was done. I imagined it last time, then. All the power and evil contained in one object is enough to drive one mad. Anova took one step away when she heard it. Don't! Screeching pierced the wilderness. Screams of animals she'd never heard filled her ears. Don't! Anova sprinted another few steps before the screams reached a pitch unimaginable. She heaved at the ground and threw up, her body shaking. The crown. She needed it. She just needed to hold it, then she would be fine. But to put it on her head. No! It was evil. Cursed. It was better to be cursed than not. Better to keep it, safe on her head. She needed it. She would give anything for it. She would trade the rest of the blood in her body for it. Her fingers touched the cold metal already. How right the world would be. No! Anova jerked another step and started sobbing. I don't want it. Don't make me take it. Her fingers shook. She would bleed for it. Kill for it. Please. She didn't know who she pleaded with until she sank to her knees. She was pleading with herself. Please. Pain burst through her like a star against the sky. It burned like the sun. The part of her that didn't want it left her and stared. Ashamed. Disgusted. Anova lurched to her feet and ran to it. It hadn't moved. It was still cold despite the stream of sunlight falling on it. Her hands didn't move to put it on her head, yet it was there already. Anova sank to her knees again, her palms spread on the ground. Something was wrong with her. She would just have to remove it through other means. She swallowed. Nothing could ever be easy, could it? A laugh pierced the air, though she didn't look up. She didn't have time for more of the crown's illusions. But the laughing didn't stop. She looked up. In the boughs of the tree on the far edge of the clearing was a creature with coal-black eyes. Its ears came to sharp points among snow-white hair. It was a goblin. When the goblin spoke, she guessed from its voice that it was male. Don't stop for my sake. I do love it when humans go mad. Anova stared and found that she could say only one thing. And does that happen often around you? His expression was flat. Not often enough. Anova suppressed a shiver. She shouldn't linger in these woods. I won't allow you to leave me only to be stabbed by the nearest goblin that lives under a tree trunk. Especially with the blood crown. She turned back to where her scant supplies were stashed, shouldered her bag, and started in the other direction when he spoke again. Aren't you trying to go somewhere? Anova gritted her teeth together. As a matter of fact, yes. As she took another few steps, he called again. You have no idea where you are. Anova turned around and glared at the goblin. Of course, she knew where she was. But as she was about to say the words, she noticed the sun overhead. It had moved. In the other direction from where she'd thought west was. Her mouth hung open for a moment before she started in a new direction. No matter. This way is north, then. The goblin started laughing again. He was only a few feet away from her, and the hairs on the back of her neck rose. Her fingers hovered over the hilt of her broken sword. Where am I, then? She said between her teeth. His eyes were like shiny beetles as he wiped his face of tears. The lost forest. Where else? He cocked his head at her. Did you not think it strange that nothing followed you within these woods? Not even your shadow. Anova's eyebrows pushed together. This goblin had already gone mad, and he was trying to take her with him. It didn't matter which way was east or west, only that she walked in the opposite direction of this creature. Despite herself, her gaze went to her feet. The sun was only a few degrees off its zenith, so she threw no shadow. Even so, her skin crawled. She shook her head. She'd already wasted too much time. As soon as she left this forest, she would find her way to the Fae settlement she was trying to get to. I shouldn't have stopped at all, Anova considered. The faster she got to civilization, the sooner she could find the knowledge she needed. She didn't linger on the fact that she might not find any information on what she sought at all. How to destroy Fae artifacts. She wouldn't go back to his estate, despite the wealth of books there. And the archives in Eastwoe were too close to Hellmyr. She would have to find some other source of information. While not getting caught. It's because she wishes to speak to you. It's why you can't leave yet. Anova stopped under the swaying canopy of branches crisscrossed above her. Without turning around, she said with a flat voice. And who would that be? I know not her name, the goblin replied. She is one of those from the other side that inhabit this space. One of the unliving. I'm sure it's you she wants." Anova turned around, words tight in her throat. "What do you mean, unliving?" But when she looked behind her, the goblin was gone. The skin on her arms rose in pimples. From the other side. Could it be? Anova's head pounded. She felt as if she'd gone as mad as the goblin had thought her to be. But a new thought burned through her brain. Is it her? Or did the goblin make it all up? How would he have known? With a stuttering heartbeat, she continued through the lost forest. She looked to the skies again, but it was as if no time had passed from where she'd woken. It hung above her like an eye. The longer she walked, the more she realized that the goblin was at least partially truthful. She was getting nowhere, but she couldn't allow herself to believe all of what he'd said. Is she really here? Anova shook her head again. It was too much to hope. Her mother was dead. But what if he wasn't lying? Anova stared above her. The branches were empty of the laughing goblin, but she asked it anyway. Where am I supposed to go? A great wind nearly knocked her to her feet. It whistled through the trees, disturbing the strange midday quiet. Anova shuddered. It was blowing in the direction the sun was angled overhead, so she followed it. She'd lost her mind. There was little other explanation for it. The blood crown had finally driven her mad. Anova's steps were too quiet, and she came to the edge of the pond where she'd washed her face before. The wind settled to a whisper in the trees. Her pulse galloped ahead of her. There was nothing here but the placid surface of the water. It was that moment that shadows engulfed the area. Her head shot up, and she saw a thick, bloated cloud eclipse the sun. Chills ran down her spine as she gripped her broken weapon tight. Mother? She couldn't allow herself to think it, but it had been so long since she'd seen her face. She'd been the only family she'd ever known, the only truly safe place in the world. Anova closed her eyes. The twin pains of longing and loss in her chest were too much to stand. Someone was watching her. It was an unignorable feeling. When Anova opened her eyes, the figure standing on top of the water stared back at her. Chapter 5. It wasn't her mother. She was Fae, and she was unearthly beautiful. Her pointed ears parted her corn silk hair that came to her waist. Eyes the color of a blue moon watched Anova. Sapphires and garnets draped her body from her ears to the bottom of her skirts, where they were sewn into the fabric. Anova had never seen this Fae before, but she knew who she was at once. Above her regal brow was an exact copy of the crown she now wore. This was the Fae princess from the Fae tale whose human lover had been murdered, and the Fae who had taken her own father's life for doing so. When she spoke, her voice was lilting, delicate, and dangerous. You know who I am, human. It wasn't a question, though Anova treated it as one. She couldn't seem to move her body or say anything else. Yes. Then you know what I did. Yes. The word hardly came out of her throat. This crown, Anova said in a hushed voice, really is the same one, isn't it? As she said it, a cloud of mist rose up from the water underneath her feet and blurred the Fae princess's outline. When the Fae spoke again, her voice came from behind Anova. She jerked around to see the princess hovering barely off the ground, her dress rippling from a non-existent breeze. The same. It carries the curse born from blood and tears. Anova's heart soared. This was who she needed to speak to. I need to know everything you can tell me about destroying it. I want to break the curse. The phantom of the Fey princess stared back at her. Such a thing is impossible. The words were out of her mouth before she could stop them. Just tell me what you know, about the spell that caused it, about anything. Any little detail could help. It was not the spell's doing, the princess interrupted. Not by itself. My treacherous father and the witch Gwenor started it, but I carried out her murderous intention. She stopped herself. But this is not the reason I have summoned you here. For the first time since the Fey princess had appeared, Anova's hand gripped the handle of her broken weapon tighter. Something in her stomach soured. Why then? She asked. Her muscles tensed. The princess took a step towards her. The crown was not meant for your kind. Anova's legs were stiff, but she forced them backwards a step. It mirrored the one the Fae had taken. It is not something I would have chosen to accept, had I known it would be like this. As if you could call what I had to do a choice, Anova thought, but she kept this to herself. The Fey princess's blue eyes glimmered. Power always has a cost, Anova. Her teeth clamped together. I never wanted its power. Don't you understand? The princess's eyes dulled. It matters not. But surely you realize what it is I must tell you. I can see that you know it in your heart. Anova took another step back. Her boots sank into wet earth. Much farther and her ankles would be submerged. I don't know what you're talking about. You do, the princess said. The shadow of a bloated cloud fell on her, obscuring her further except for her piercing eyes. You have already heard it, felt it. Anova's eyebrows came together. This was just a spirit before her. She was the one made of flesh and bone. What did beings of dust and air and mist know? Riddles and dreams. But something deeper inside Anova did know. Perhaps it was that she hadn't wanted to understand what it meant. The crown's effect on her. Perhaps it was because she already had figured it out from the first time that she'd tried to pry it off her head. Or the first time it had drawn blood from her. Or caused her pain. The blood crown will kill you. Anova heard the Fey princess's words, but they sounded far off. It was as if she were underwater already, drowning among the river stones and fleeting minnows. It had started killing her already. Anova could barely remember a day that had passed since she'd woken with it, that she hadn't had splitting pain at her temples. When Miriam had told her that the blood crown would kill any human who attempted to use it, she had assumed that death would come immediately, if it were to come at all. A swallow scraped along her throat. Does Leander know? No. Anova's voice trembled despite her best efforts. There must be something I can do. She would do anything, trade anything to live. She was, from the moment of her birth, a survivor. She would claw out bits of life from around her until it was enough to save her. It was what she'd always done. The Fey princess's lips were tight. She allowed a handful of words past them, however. You have 1 moon left. Chapter 6. Anova felt when she took her last step in the lost forest. The goblin had been right. Her shadow returned as soon as she was free of the area. Time passed in a blur for her. Her feet plodded forward, and her senses were too numb to notice where she was. But her mind didn't stop. 1 moon. She had a month left. Anova couldn't afford to doubt what the Fey Princess had said. She was right. Anova had already known that it was hurting her, that it hadn't been meant for the likes of her. But to kill her? 1 more moon. Her temples throbbed as if in reminder. She had a month to destroy it, a month to save herself. As she walked, 2 things became clear to her. First, she needed power, or rather protection. She needed enough of it to stop the constant attacks on her life. She couldn't break the curse on the crown if she was always defending her life. Second, she needed knowledge. The spirit of the Fey Princess hadn't believed there was a way to break the curse. Anova couldn't let herself believe that. She couldn't give up like she had. But first, she needed to stop wasting time. It took her only a few hours to find a Fey estate with a stable. As Anova crouched in the bushes and observed, her stomach twisted. Unlike the abandoned manor she'd taken shelter in on her way to the border forest, this manor was clearly inhabited. Flowers spilled from window boxes. The hedges had been immaculately formed into swans that looked to be on the verge of flight. It was perhaps the most beautiful home she'd seen in Fey. A figure emerged from the house and walked to the stables. Anova chewed on her lip. It was likely just a stable boy, but she couldn't let anyone see her. It was then she heard a soft chuckle on the wind. Anova's gaze shot up. Her heart pounded with suspicion. Above her, the goblin with white hair lounged in a tree branch. I should have taken care of him in the forest. But it had been hard to convince herself that he hadn't been a spirit too. Stop following me, she bit out. You're not getting the crown. She didn't have time for another assassin. Things were getting out of hand. Oh, I don't care about that. His black eyes shined in the shadows. But I can't resist a bargain with a human. What are you talking about? Anova said. I'm not bargaining with you for anything. Are you so sure about that? His coal eyes flickered to the Fey manor on the hill ahead of them. You are in want of something they have. It's in your eyes. Before she could say anything in response, he was on the ground before her. Although he was shorter than she was by several heads, she knew not to underestimate him. Her hand itched to draw her sword fragment. Anova was careful. If the goblin thought he had the upper hand, he would abuse it. With a masked expression, she said, And what is it you think you can give me? He cocked his head to one side, and his lips revealed teeth as pointed as a sea monster's. A distraction. I am singularly gifted in them. Anova crossed her arms. She believed it, but that wasn't the problem. She needed to be specific about the wording when dealing with Fey bargains. And exactly what would such a bargain require of me? The white-haired goblin's smile widened. Only a drop or 2 of blood. Her blood ran cold, and her voice was flat when she spoke. No. There was power in blood. The crown on her head wouldn't let her forget that. The goblin shrugged. Fine. 1 act of service to me, the nature of which will be determined at a later date. Anova's mouth hung open. This was worse. Much worse. But a drop of her blood? She didn't know enough about the kind of magic that goblin Fey could do, and she was sorely aware of that fact now. Other Fey drew their power from the moon. The crowned Fey had their own magic which came from the earth. But goblin fae were something else entirely. A loophole occurred to her then. The dead couldn't pay their debts. And if she lived, well, even better. She would be more equipped to deal with the mad goblin's request once she ridded herself of the blood crown. "I'll agree on a few conditions," Anova said. "First, this act of service will be repaid in more than 1 month from now. Second, it will not endanger my life. Third, I would know who you are before entering into a deal with you." The goblin appeared to consider these conditions for a few seconds before saying, "Yes, yes." He paused and added, "Ritavar is what they call me." Anova blinked. Somehow she hadn't thought he would agree. When she looked back to the Fae estate before them, the keeper of the horses was brushing the hide of one of them. "I would be in East Woe in a day by horseback." 1 month. The words were out of her mouth before she'd realized. "I agree." Ritavar smiled his pointy grin again. "The bargain is set, then." Anova kept to the bushes surrounding the estate. The sun would set soon, and she needed to get a horse before nightfall. As she passed among the shadows, she caught sight of the Fae she'd assumed to be their stable boy. Up close, he looked far from it. The Fae was tall and muscled, and something hit his back at regular intervals. A sword staff. This was one of the King's Guard. Anova's stomach sank. He'd likely tried to kill her at one point. It doesn't matter if it's the dead Fae King himself. I need a horse. Even in the day, there were no shadows to hide in. She edged around the structure, awaiting the goblin's distraction. As the minutes started to crawl by and her shadow grew longer, she realized something. The Fae was starting to walk towards her hiding place, exactly where the horse feed was. She cursed her judgment. And Ritavar had tricked her. He'd never intended to help her. Sweat coated her back. That bastard! She grabbed her broken sword with ferocity. It would be little match against his sword staff, but it would have to do. Anova shifted in preparation for her attack, and it was enough to catch the Fae's attention. His gaze shot to where she waited in shadows. It was time to create her own distraction then. Before she could emerge, a shadow flickered through the area like a moon blotting out the sun. The Fae pulled out his sword staff and swiveled away from her hiding spot. For suddenly, opposite him was a monster. She might have called it a wolf if it weren't 3 times the size of one. She might have called it a bear if it weren't faster than she'd ever seen one move. Oversized claws dug up the earth as it darted around the Fae. Its coal-black eyes gleamed underneath white fur. Anova held back a gasp. Somehow, it was Ritavar. "Stop standing about slack-jawed. This is your chance." But looking at the beast that had been the goblin, she could hardly move. Fear burrowed into the marrow of her bones. This was a predator of predators. Anova pushed her feet forward, making far too much noise despite herself. But a roar covered up the noise, and she ran towards the bay mare that had skittered off at the sight of the clawed creature in their midst. As she fixed her with the saddle she'd stolen near the stables, Anova tried to calm her horse. Her own breath still drew too short, and she knew the mare could sense her fear. As they kicked up a storm of dirt at the edge of the forest where she'd made the deal with Ritavar, she spared one last look behind her. The thing that had been Ritavar had opened its wide maw, and each tooth was as thick as her forearm. Spittle flew from its mouth. She'd made a deal with a monster. And she had a feeling it wouldn't be the last one she would make before this place killed her. Chapter 7. She hoped there weren't Fae here. Night had fallen, and she felt as jumpy as a field mouse in a snake den. Anova couldn't shake the feeling that the folk were nearby. Anova and her horse had made considerable progress, and she was certain she was already in Eastwoe. The air felt cooler, and the ground was soaked with mud in places. Moss draped from lazy trees that leaned to one side. She missed the vibrancy of the Sora lands. Is this the right decision? Or am I heading into the maws of another monster? Anova's hands shook. The possibility that this was all a trick to get the blood crown was too likely for her comfort. The possibility that her blood would be splattered on the palace floor as soon as she stepped foot inside it was also too likely. If there was one thing that she knew about Hellmyr, it was that he was hungry for power. What more powerful object existed in this world? But there was no other option before her, no other path, no other assistance except... Anova squeezed the mare to encourage her to stop her light gallop. Someone had already come through these trees. Branches had been cleared, and although they had nearly been hidden, she saw evidence of tracks when they stopped. Anova breathed in the silence for several minutes, debating. She could turn around and go the other way. She should. It was then she heard something through the trees. It can't be. It sounded like a voice that she'd once known. Shallow breath filled her and left her for several seconds. The blood crown was going to drive her to madness before it could kill her. Anova raised the mare's reins, preparing to speed them into a fresh direction, when she heard it again. His voice. Her heart jumped into her throat. Leander was nearby. But the problem was, she didn't know if they were on the same side any longer. Anova slid off the mare and removed her saddle and reins, stuffing what she could into the pack she'd stolen from Lirin. She patted the horse's hide and hoped that she wouldn't wander too far. Next, Anova removed the pack from her shoulder and gathered a bundle of fallen leaves to pour over her. The smells of earth and rotting vegetation clung to her. Fae could smell better than humans, and if she were going to sneak up on him, she needed to disguise her scent. And she needed to prove to herself she could still best him in this way, that she could still outwit any Fae. She gritted her teeth. Anova stuffed her stolen belongings in the hollow of a twisted juniper tree. She brushed against the branches for good measure before she turned in the direction which she'd heard his voice. Anticipation flooded her veins. She hadn't seen him since she'd killed the Fae King. Surely, he'd wish to work with her to destroy the blood crown. And yet, he had been willing to kill himself to destroy it before. Why would it be hard for him to kill a human to destroy it now? Her heart throbbed. Despite the charade they had played together, Anova knew there had been something between the two of them. Her brain had taunted her for believing it, but her heart remembered. It remembered the gentleness with which he'd moved her hair out of her face, how he'd broken past her carefully constructed walls, how he'd given himself to their enemy to keep her safe. No, she hadn't imagined that. Leander's voice was loud enough to be on the other side of the cluster of trees ahead of her. As noiselessly as she could, Anova slipped into a bramble of jewel-like berries. Silence fell upon the air. She bit into the edge of her tongue. So much for disguising her presence. Stop this. Enough of this hiding. If he really did, if he sent that assassin after me, then I'll know soon enough. And she would show him exactly what she did with her enemies. Before she could emerge from her hiding place with her broken sword in hand, she heard a voice from the other side of the bramble bush, though it wasn't Leander's this time. It was Lycasta. When her voice broke the silence, Anova kept deathly still to hear it. I can check it if you'd like. No, I don't think that's necessary. There's nothing else here. I made sure of it myself. The sound of Leander's voice made her freeze. What were they doing together? He despised her. She'd been the one to shred his mother's dress, framing Anova for it in the process. And yet, Leander continued to speak to her. Lie, I can't believe it. All of it. Her heart thudded too loudly. Lie? Who was Lie? I know, Lycasta responded. When I thought I'd lost you. It's okay. You can say it. Leander's voice went too soft. Are you really here, Leander? Lycasta asked. The sound of his name made Anova cringe with a strange sort of pain. I mean, you won't vanish on thin air, will you? You won't leave? The Fae fell silent. Anova couldn't help herself. With the utmost care, she shifted herself within the shield of brambles around her until she could see a small space between the leaves and berries. Her worst fears were confirmed. It was Leander. There could be no doubt about it. He was as strikingly handsome as she'd remembered, his raven hair falling to one side and his arrogant mouth twitched halfway up in a smirk. His second dagger was sheathed at his waist. He was even wearing the coat he'd worn as the Fae King's second-in-command. It framed his body as he leaned over Lycasta to kiss her fully on the mouth. Not for her, he said between kisses. Not for anyone. Anova stared, unmoving. She could no longer hear their voices, or anything for that matter. She pulled herself deeper into the brambles, hardly aware of the thorns digging into her skin. She couldn't hear them anymore. She didn't want to. At some point, Anova pulled herself out of the berry bush. Like a worried mother, her shadow followed her. How could she have been so dense? What was she compared to another Fae? She was human. Not just a human, she reminded herself. Her hands shook. A lying thief. Street trash. All Fae used humans like they were disposable. Why had she thought him any different? No, there was only one path before her. One way to get the power she needed. No one else would care to save a human's life here. It was daft and dangerous to assume otherwise. She left the two Fae behind and headed for Eastwoe Palace. Even if she had to lie and cheat to do it, she would destroy the Blood Crown. Anova released a breath that had been tightly held in her chest. At least she was good at lying. Chapter 8. The palace rose before her like a dark sun. Dawn broke behind it, draping it more in shadow. She'd never seen it in the light. The memory of that night tugged low in her belly. No. Anova was leaving that behind. She would get stronger. But she wasn't going to blindly trust Hellmyr either. She would observe him before accepting what he'd proposed. She'd already released the mare just outside of Eastwoe's streets. Her pack was light on her back. The building was grand, even by Faye's standards. Columns supported the black roof, and black metal twisted into roses formed walls around it. The soft glow of lanterns hanging from poles illuminated the area. Near the center of the palace, she knew there to be the hall where the Fae King had hosted the quarter-moon fete. There's a window there, but knowing Fae design, there will be more than one moon-facing window. It took her less than 5 minutes to find a window that was accessible by the ground. A twisted tree leaned too close to the palace, points of lantern light filling its branches. It was almost begging her to scale it and use it to enter the palace. Anova pulled herself up, branch over branch, until she reached the farthest that she could drag herself. She shimmied down the length of the most horizontal branch, the one scraping next to the window. Goblins had been carved into the palace's exterior, and they glared at her as she climbed closer to the window. They were strikingly lifelike, and a part of her worried that they'd been alive at one point. Stop distracting yourself. If she fell from this distance, it would probably not be fatal, though she would surely be discovered, and possibly injured. And if she were going to enter this situation with an advantage, that wouldn't do. Hellmyr could have been lying to get her to surrender more easily. I could be climbing into a trap right now, she reminded herself. She silenced the voice within her as she eyed the distance between the windowsill and the branch. Anova breathed in slowly. She could do this. She'd jumped as far before from her and Juris's attic window. She didn't care to think on how many times she'd bruised herself from doing that, though. A moment passed, and she leaped. Anova's hands and body found the ledge she'd aimed for, and she hadn't even made a noise. After waiting a moment for her heart to calm, she pried open the glass of the window. It helped that this wasn't the first window she'd used to enter a Fae dwelling. She knew better now how the locking mechanism worked. The problem with Fae architecture is that it's more concerned with aesthetics than functionality, or rather security. Much like the Fae themselves. Anova was inside one of the corridors that snaked through the palace. After finding no guards nearby, she lowered herself to the floor carefully. Somewhere within were the Great Hall and the archives, but beyond those, there was a king's bedroom. She might have been walking into the jaws of the monster, but she would do it on her terms. Anova flitted from bust to bust carved out of marble. She froze. The sound of their voices and footsteps bounced around the polished surfaces surrounding her. Holding herself close, she crouched near to the floor and held her breath, listening. Not Hellmyr. Good. Dawn was breaking, which meant most Fae would be sleeping or retired by now. They passed, and she sprinted to her next cover. She fit perfectly behind a podium with a pot of orchids on it. As soon as she got into cover, pain split into her head. It assaulted her body, spreading from her cranium to her ends. Her body slammed against the ground, and her senses betrayed her. She hoped none of them found her like this. Anova was being dragged. The pain in her skull had retreated somewhere in her body like a coward, hiding in wait. In a flurry of limbs, bites, and scratches, she tried to get out of the rough grasp of the guards forcing her forward. But too soon, the edge of a blade had found her back. The Fae whispered to her, "Blood crown or not, if you don't comply, we will make you. You don't wish to experience that, human." Anova didn't respond, though she allowed her limbs to slacken. Her mind raced. Was she being taken to her execution? Or to the dungeons? She shouldn't have come here. The guards flung her inside a room with only a chair and a lantern hanging from the wall. Her blood raged inside her. She never let a male touch her without touching him back just as hard. They flooded the room, and her irritation overflowed. Why did they think they needed no less than 5 fully armed Fae to apprehend an unarmed human? "Sit," the guard who had whispered to her ordered. Anova did not. "What do you want with me?" "Spies are always questioned," he said. She ground out. "I'm not a spy." He moved so that his face consumed her vision. A vein in his jaw flicked. "Why are you acting like one, then?" "I'm here to speak to him," Anova said. "Or didn't you hear him at the border forests?" A suspicion dawned on her. He wasn't here at all. She'd broken in for no reason. "You'll speak to us," he said. "Then we'll see what we'll do with you." This wasn't cutting it. She would need to take them out. Breath flowed in and out of her. She needed to take his sword. It was then that a commotion rose outside the room. It was her chance. If she could rush them, even without a weapon, she could get out of this room. But when the door burst open, slamming on the wall next to it, The very fae she had been looking for walked in. A stream of foul curses flooded from his mouth, some of which even she hadn't heard before. A sword of gleaming silver hung at his waist, and blood had flecked it. His face was fixed into an expression of pure fury. It looked like it belonged on one of the busts lining the halls outside the room. He didn't look at her. His sword came loose from where it had been at his waist, and he held it at the back of the guard's head that stood between them. Hellmyr's voice was tight, controlled. "Before I take off your head, I'll allow you to decide if you prefer to beg for mercy or apologize to her first." The guard said through his teeth, "She broke in. I wouldn't care if she lit the archives on fire with you in it." Hellmyr moved in a blur, and something hit the ground with a smack. The guard's body followed a second later. To the remaining guards, Hellmyr promised, "If you touch her again, I will do something much worse to you." Anova refused to look at the floor in case the sight made her falter, and instead leveled her gaze on the new Fae King. "I'm here to speak with you." She was proud of how even her voice came out. Hellmyr's grackle eyes held her there, his lashes brushing against his skin. "I knew you'd come." She swallowed, hoping that the Fae King couldn't hear how her heartbeat had sped up at his words. What had she gotten herself into? Chapter 9. It was bigger than Anova even imagined it could be. The first room she stepped into was cathedral-like. It was almost as big as Hellmyr's ego. As soon as she stepped into the suite that she'd been told was hers alone and not for some army of 100 men, she was pushed and prodded and poked until she'd surrendered all her clothes down to her underthings. Fae servants flitted around like buzzing insects, taking measurements and holding fabric against her skin like sea foam or lavender could bring out the rosiness of her skin. She knew the truth, though, even without having to look in the floor-length mirrors angled at her from different locations. She looked like she'd been sleeping in a dumpster for at least a week. A frown twitched across her face. It wasn't as if she had to imagine how that felt. "Does it hurt, my lady?" asked one of the Fae attending to her. Before Anova could answer, however, the Fae had already turned her head to one of the others and hissed out, "Don't jab her, Sarah!" With horror, she realized that the one the other servant had yelled at was a girl. A human girl. Her hair had been pinned into a tight bun, revealing the soft curve of her distinctly human ears. Her face still had the roundness of childhood, and her eyes had darted to the floor from the admonishment. At most, she must have been a year or so past her first decade. She's at the age I lost Mother. "I'm fine." Anova looked at the Fae servant. "Don't yell at her." The Fae servant had the decency to avert her eyes. "Yes, my lady." Anova stared. She wasn't used to such a response, so much that it unnerved her. She decided then. The servants had moved on from taking her measurements to applying ointment and gauze to her scrapes and bruises. In truth, she could already feel the stinging pain mingled with relief that came with healing a wound. But she had to speak to the girl alone. She straightened. Despite the hatred of her that burned her veins like a poison, Anova channeled the only person she could think of who always got her way. Madame Hinterfell. "That's enough," Anova snapped. "You have what you need. Leave the medicines. The girl will apply the rest." At once, her retinue retreated from the room like she'd told them that the slowest one would be executed. Anova suppressed a shiver. Perhaps that's because Hellmyr already has. As they left, some of them snuck glances at the blood crown. Something itched at the back of her throat. She couldn't forget the target she was now. It could be the last one I make. The human girl stood to her side, her eyes still to the floor as she awaited further instruction. Anova wasn't quite sure where to start, but something had to be done. She flew to the drawers at the edges of the room, but she found that most of those contained only things like necklaces and earrings. On second thought, these may be useful. She'll need money to survive out there. Anova grabbed a bundle of dangle earrings like they were the neck of a chicken. Anova turned around. Sarah had snuck up on her. "Pardon, my lady, but I could put those on for you, and your medicine as well." "Do you remember how you were transported here?" Anova said. "I can't go back to the human lands with you, so we'll have to wait until there's an opportunity to get you closer to the border forests." "Except the barrier to the human lands is impenetrable right now," Anova remembered. She silently cursed. Sarah blinked. She had a tin of ointment in her hands. "I'm not sure I understand, my lady." She was getting ahead of herself. Anova breathed through her nose. If she had to, she would wait until the perfect moment to sneak out the girl. Better to be careful than to be caught. But if she were caught, as long as she had successfully snuck the girl out of Fae, what could Hellmyr do? Punish her? She'd like to see him try. And relieving her of servants would be a blessing. Anova put down the earrings. When she eyed the doorway for shadows and found none lingering under its eaves, she turned toward Sarah. "I promise I'll get you out of this place. Out of Fae," she clarified. Sarah took a step back from Anova, seemed to realize her misstep in doing so, and froze. "I don't want to leave," she bit on her lip. "My lady?" She stared at the human servant. "You don't have to pretend with me. I know they trick humans and steal children from our lands." Against her will, she remembered the cage of human children that the previous Fae king had procured to start his war against their kind. Her stomach twisted like a wet rag. She hoped that, when Leander had freed them, they'd gotten to the other side of the barrier. Remembering him made her stomach cramp even more. But the girl was shaking her head. "That's not how I came to be here. I made a bargain." Her chin raised to look Anova in the eye. "I don't want to leave." Anova frowned. Their bargains always benefit them more than us. But she sat down, abandoning her search for supplies. "What were the terms?" Sarah looked away. 3 years of service here, and my grandfather's life is saved." Anova swallowed. She could understand her reluctance to leave now. What was more, this bargain was unusually fair, by Fae standards. But there were always loopholes. And he yet lives? "I receive letters from him. My benefactor has already healed him, though he is still recovering from his illness." Anova nodded to herself. Unusually fair. She looked over at her. Apparently, satisfied that Anova wasn't going to try to force her back to Urbess early, Sarah had picked up the tin of medicine and approached her once more. Anova remained as still as a statue for Sarah while she applied the cream to her cuts. "How much time do you have left here?" "Most of it," Sarah admitted. "I came here only recently, my lady," she added. There was a knock at the door leading outside her rooms. Anova called for the Fae on the other side of it to come inside, her thoughts on her broken piece of sword that they'd confiscated from her. Her hands itched for it. A Fae servant emerged, his eyes flying to the floor. She'd forgotten to throw something on besides her underthings, but it was done now. Enough of them had already seen and poked at her earlier for her to lose most of her shame, she figured. "His Majesty requests your presence when you are ready, my lady," he said. She nodded her head, forgot that he wasn't looking at her, and said, "Wait outside the door. I'll be ready in a second." "As you wish." he said, still looking at the floor. "Will your maidservant be coming with you, my lady?" "Yes, please." Anova shut her mouth. People used to getting what they wanted didn't say please. A secret smile pulled at her lips, though she suppressed it. She could get used to ordering about Faye. And now that she'd stolen the girl for herself, she would make sure Sarah had the easiest job in the palace. The nascent smile dissolved on her mouth. "You won't be in this place for long. Remember why you're doing this." No matter if she reached her goal or not, she wouldn't be staying here. When she and Sarah emerged from her suite, the Fae servant led them through Eastwell Palace. Anova's eyes scoured her surroundings, mapping within her brain where they were and where they headed. If she were going to find out anything here, she'd need to be able to move about undetected. The archives will be the obvious place to start, she considered. Her fingers twitched. 1 month. I have to find something here. The Fae servant suddenly stopped before them. They'd scaled many more stairs than she'd guessed there could fit inside the palace. He opened the door and stepped to the side to allow them in. Only it wasn't in at all. The coolness of fresh air filled her lungs, and she stepped outside on a wide balcony. The first thing she noticed was the sunrise, shafts of golden light piercing the gray and blue sky. The second thing she noticed was the flood of flowers. Black and red roses were everywhere she could see. It was as lush as a garden, except for directly ahead of her. It was where he was seated in a black metal chair. Next to him was an empty one. The servant who had led her to the balcony excused himself and closed the door. Except for Sarah, they were alone. And the human girl had taken to gazing out over the edge of the balcony a few paces from her as if to give them space. Anova wasn't sure if that was going to be a good thing or not. She swallowed. At least the day had properly dawned, which meant his magic had gone with the night. But he still wore his blood-stained sword. "I knew you'd be back for me." He leaned back in his chair, and Anova suddenly noticed that the dress the servants had procured for her to wear on such short notice coincidentally matched his clothes. He seemed to have observed the same thing. His eyes lingered on the shape her dress made. She gritted her teeth. She'd forgotten how insufferable this one was. Lie. Fake your way through it. This is a charade. He is a means to an end. And yet, what came out of her mouth was much closer to the truth than she would have liked. "You think I came for you? And not your power?" she said through her teeth. She should have started constructing the mask she was to wear here. If he found out that she only wanted this power in order to crumple it under her foot, he would likely have her chained up. Hellmyr shrugged. "Soon you will." Anova narrowed her eyes at him. Before she could respond to that, he stood. Something about her face made him stop. He closed the distance between them, and with hardly a touch at all, traced the cut on her face. "Didn't they do their job?" he said. At once she knew what he was talking about. "They did," Anova said. Although she hadn't agreed with the Fae servant yelling at Sarah, they didn't deserve to be punished for simply following her orders and leaving her alone. Hellmyr's eyes went to her expression. "I heard you dismissed them. Well, most of them." "I don't trust them," she said. It was honest enough, and she felt it was something that a human would say regardless. For what she needed to do here, she couldn't have a crowd following her around. His gaze narrowed. "Smart." He pulled away from her after a quick glance at the blood crown still on her head. She shifted. She hadn't missed that. "You can't fool me, you know. You're just after the blood crown." "And if I was, what would you do?" Hellmyr was before her in a blur. His finger found the base of her throat, and her heartbeat bumped into it too quickly. "Kill me first." Anova didn't respond. She felt in her bones she should have. After a moment, he laughed. "Leander trained you well. Or have you been like this from the start?" he said. She flinched at the mention of him. She needed to say something so they could stop talking about Leander, or herself. "You never answered my question," she said. "What's to stop you from doing the same?" "You haven't tried to kill me yet, which means you're already convinced I'm not." His eyes gleamed dangerously, and he pulled his hand away from her. "But you still don't realize it, do you?" He took several steps until he was before the balcony railing. His back was still to her as he said, "It's not only the blood crown. You're the key. I meant what I said that day." Something scratched at the back of her throat. She remembered. "Because when I'm High King, I want you to be my queen." "A human queen, a Fey king. Together, we will rule uncontested." Hellmyr turned around. "And not just over Fey." He stepped forward. "Over all lands. Everything." Hellmyr was before her too quickly. His finger found the underside of her chin. "Which brings me to the reason you're here. Do you accept these terms, Anova?" He lifted her face with a slight pull. "Would you wed yourself to a wicked Fey?" A smirk appeared on his lips. "Think hard on it. I can't promise such a thing wouldn't make you even worse than me." She was using him for protection and the access to the knowledge she needed. That's all this was. So why was her heart pounding this much? This was what she did. Pretend. She had one moon left, and she would need all the power he offered her. Too bad it wasn't going to be for what he thought it was. An ultimate reign over both Fae and humans. She was going to destroy his tyranny from the inside out, beginning with the blood crown. When the time came, she would wipe the smirk from his face. Or she would die trying. "I will," she answered. Chapter 10. They expected her to sleep, which was exactly why she shouldn't. Anova had picked clean the plate of food they'd delivered to her rooms, a light breakfast of glazed pears, cheese, and bread. Faye didn't normally eat at this hour. In fact, most of the Fae in the palace would have retired at dawn had she not broken in. This fact made this the perfect time for her to do her work. She guessed that all but his day guards had likely gone to bed by now. The pull of the moon and night on them was strong, and she'd seen it with her own eyes on many occasions. Wakefulness during the day meant that more time under the moon was stolen from them. Judging from the angle of the sun outside her windows, it was still early morning. The landscape of Fae beyond the palace was bathed in morning light, though plenty of shadows still lurked from the night. Perfect. Anova changed out of the striking blue dress that she'd worn to meet Hellmyr in. When she'd arrived back to her rooms from their conversation, she'd found the closets full to the brim already. It was day now, so it couldn't have been made by magic. All items influenced by Fae magic returned to their original state upon daybreak. She frowned. Of course, there are more than enough servants to work to the bone here to have produced these. Anova silenced herself and pulled out a pair of what looked to be riding breeches and a simple cotton shirt that puffed at the arms. They were the most practical-looking pieces she could find, and among the few garments that weren't dresses. As much as she itched to try all the dresses on and steal her favorites, there would be nowhere to go with them. What would she do? Go back to Urbess and fence them for money? That didn't matter now. Anova shook her head. She needed to think clearly. After dressing, she left the part of the suite that she'd claimed as her bedroom and walked through the other rooms until she came to the door to the halls outside. She crouched near the ground to see a shadow fall from the other side. Of course, there was no chance they'd ever leave her alone. But that wasn't about to stop her. Anova opened the door, and her armed Fae guard pivoted to her. Anova suppressed a curse. He didn't even look sleepy. "What's wrong?" he said. "My lady," he added at the end. The words sounded especially wrong coming from a Fae guard. Anova tried to remember if he had been one of the guards who had apprehended her when she'd broken in. She supposed it didn't matter. "Nothing. I'll be going out of my rooms for a bit," Anova said and sidestepped him. He stepped so he was once again before her. "Perhaps you'd like to wait until this afternoon." It wasn't a question, but a command. Anova's teeth dug into her tongue, but despite her brewing agitation, she returned to her rooms, mumbling her acquiescence as she did so. At least she knew she was right. There weren't enough guards awake now to keep an eye on her. It was a good thing, really. But this could also mean she was much more of a prisoner than even she'd feared. Both, most likely. Good thing she had help this time. "What's wrong, my lady?" Sarah's eyes went to the closed door that separated them from their Fae guard. The similarity between their reactions was unnerving. Anova shook her head. Nothing. When Sarah had emerged from her room within Anova's suite, she'd worried that she'd woken her. However, Sarah seemed just as awake as Anova and the guard. She added, "I need some help if you're able." "Of course," Sarah said. "Anything you wish." Anova frowned at her response, though she wasn't sure why. It was time for a different approach. She pressed herself close to Sarah's ear and lowered her voice. "Are you up for tricking some Fae?" When she didn't respond, Anova pulled away from her. Sarah's eyes were on the door. She must have realized they had a guard, too. Anova bit at her lip. She shouldn't involve her. What if she was punished for Anova's actions? Just as she was about to tell her to forget the matter, Sarah turned to face her again. But this time, her eyes gleamed in the light. "I am, my lady." Anova mirrored her small smile with a bigger one. "Good." After they went over Anova's plan, she got into place. The reception room of her suite was filled with Fae-made furniture, and she fitted herself in the narrow gap between the back of a dresser and the wall. The door to the halls nearly came off its hinges when it slammed open. Anova kept still. The guard's voice filled the space. "Where is it? Is it here?" "Through here, sir." Sarah's voice sounded as if she'd been crying. Anova's heart soared. The girl was proving to be a natural at this. She might have to use her help for other things. As soon as she heard Sarah's door open and close, Anova ducked out from behind her cover and sprinted for the door. She was out of her suite and into the halls, though not before she heard the Fae guard swear in the closed room behind her. She grinned. He must have found the spider that Sarah was pretending to cry over. Most males were happiest playing the hero and savior. It seemed this one was no exception. By the time he killed the spider they'd found dangling from the ceiling, she would be long gone from this part of the palace. While it might have been more cathartic to knock the Fae unconscious for a few hours while she left her rooms, that would have been far messier. It was hard to explain away the loss of several hours without the Fae raising important questions. Once she reached the bottom floor of the palace, the archives were easy to find. As she'd hoped, there were few guards patrolling the palace, and their presence thinned the farther she went from the suite. Her memory of that night was burnt into her mind, and she used it as a guide. How things change. She'd wanted to escape Hellmyr and find Leander. No, even then, Leander had found Lycasta to enjoy his night with. She bit into her cheek. She needed to stop thinking like she'd had some sort of hold on him, like they'd been something to each other. Maybe that's because it only meant something to you. A noise tried to escape her throat, but she swallowed it down. They'd gone their separate ways, hadn't they? No, actually. Leander likely wants you dead. Her heart throbbed like the pain at her temples. Well, maybe he'll get his wish after all. The math in her head screamed at her, yelling that she'd wasted so much time already. If you die, it's your fault. You didn't do enough. Anova was inside the archives. She didn't remember slipping inside the doors, but the smell of old pages was enough to break the spell that had fallen on her. It was time to do some work. She started in the section of the archives where she'd found the book of Fae Tales. It wasn't still here, of course, but maybe she'd find ones like it. Or so she hoped. After shelving the third copy of the same book on war strategy, her fingers shook too much to hold another one. She flexed her stiff fingers and massaged blood into them. She'd searched perhaps 8 entire bookshelves. She needed to try something else. Curses? Fae artifacts? Where else would this information be? Through the windows into the archives, the angle of the sun sharpened. Her nails dug into her palms. Her unsupervised time was coming to an end too quickly. She closed her eyes. Leave now and they won't discover that I ever left. Or stay and risk being caught. And never leave my room again. Anova sank to the floor, stirring up a cloud of dust. Her head fell into her hands. There was only one person for this job, and she was pretty sure he wanted her dead right now. Actually, Leander was only pretending to be the scholar. That was his brother. She was beginning to realize she'd never really known him at all. They were going to find her here and drag her back to her rooms. She needed to get up, but she couldn't move. Anova lurched to her feet. There had to be something here. A clue, a word or two. Something to prove that the blood crown could be destroyed. That she could live. As she walked past the sections of shelves, scanning their spines, something occurred to her. She stopped. There was no mention of the crown at all in these books. Someone had removed them all. And she was fairly certain she knew who. Moving twice as fast as she had before, Anova arrived at the correct section of the archives out of breath. But she didn't pause to catch her breath as she pulled every folder and book free that she could reach. This was the section she'd wanted to find upon her first arrival here. These were the personal folios of the Fae King, specifically the High King that she had killed. When Hellmyr seized power, the Fae Guards must have moved the previous Fae King's notes and records here. The reason she'd originally wanted to search these documents stung in her mouth. She had never discovered which of the Fae had killed her mother. Anova blinked back a tear. She needed to focus. The stack of parchment in her hand had a title written over the front, and it made her want to throw the entire thing through the window. The Human War. They'd narrowly kept his Fae army from invading Urbes. Anova didn't wish to read what he'd planned to do to her people after getting out of the boundary forests. And yet, she started reading his war notes. Her stomach clenched. It would have been merciless. He'd planned to make the survivors their slaves. No bargains, no illusion of trade between them. When she read what was on the last page, Anova's heart froze. She read it again. It didn't make sense. A third time. The war that never was a front. It had intended to be a cover for what the High King had wanted much, much more than human slaves. A voice pierced the dimness of the archives. A good sneak covers her tracks. One would think you'd have learned that by now. It was far too much like the first time she'd been here when the High King had caught her and Leander in the archives. But this time, she couldn't hide. Dressed in a grey silk dress that likened her to a shadow, Lotharia stepped into a shaft of lantern light seeping between two bookshelves. Her golden eyes were sly like a predatory bird's, and the tips of her ears were laden with gold jewelry that caught the light against her dark hair. The information she'd learned seconds ago rattled around in her head like coins dropped on a busy street. Anova couldn't let her know that she knew this. Does Hellmyr know? He can't, or they would have continued the invasion at once. And the only way to cover her tracks now was to destroy the papers. It was less a decision and more an instinct. Anova ran. Because Lotharia wasn't expecting it, she had a healthy head start. But if there was one thing Anova had proven to her, over and over, it was that the Fae were faster than her. Already, her lead was vanishing. She ducked between stacks, changing directions. Ultimately, it didn't matter if she were caught. It mattered if they discovered why she'd come here in the first place and what she'd learned in the archives. Her gaze darted from one end of the archives to the other. There was nothing here but pages older than her great-grandmother. It was then that she remembered something Hellmyr had said to her when she'd broken inside his palace. She smiled. Lotharia's voice floated above the stacks. "This is fruitless. You are doing nothing but incriminating yourself." "You knew what I was when you helped me that night in the High King's castle," she called back. "You knew when you helped me in the Boundary Forests. But then," Anova said, barely pausing as she silently plucked a lantern from a table. "Like recognizes like, doesn't it?" The key was to get as far away as possible from the place her pursuer thought she was at any given moment. Anova picked up a book and threw it over her head where it sailed clear over two shelves. It produced a solid thunk where it smacked the floor, and she ran in the other direction. "You stumbled into a plan orchestrated by others and claim yourself the mastermind, do you?" Lotharia asked. "I still kept the blood crown out of your son's hands." She bit down on her response. This was where the magic needed to happen. Judging from Lotharia's voice, they were as far apart as she could hope. Anova shoved herself against the end of a bookshelf and carefully removed the top of the lantern. The heat from the flame brushed against her face, and she fed the parchment inside. It licked each paper until it turned to ash. She couldn't let this information out. Not if she wanted to live. Her heart galloped in her chest fast enough to make her dizzy. She couldn't let them know she'd destroyed anything either. Anova rushed to hang the lantern on a wall hook, but when she started to run for the exit, a shadow stepped out from behind a shelf, blocking her path. In Lotharia's hand was a long blade well within reach of Anova's neck. She froze before the sight of the weapon. Sweat coated her back. Anova cocked her head. "What is it you want, Lotharia?" "A reason not to have one of my guards kill you in your sleep," she said. Her golden eyes held her there, and Anova was suddenly quite sure she wasn't exaggerating. Anova felt as if a spider walked on her spine. When she spoke, her voice was tight. "We're on the same side. That should be reason enough." "Are we? It didn't seem so when you took my son hostage." Her expression was flat. She narrowed her eyes and took a step forward. The tip of the sword was nearly at her throat. "And it doesn't seem so now. What are you doing here, Anova?" She swallowed. Things were almost going the worst possible way. At least I destroyed the war notes. Her pulse climbed higher. She had to convince her. She had to get out of this. She'd found the key, the one that might have been enough to end the crown permanently, but it would do her no good if the secret died with her. But there was no lie convincing enough. It doesn't matter if I can get away. A poisoned sip of water, a knife in the night. That's all it would take. Anova cursed to herself. Where was the power she'd supposedly stolen now? She said the only thing she could. The truth. I wanted to know more about the blood crown, how it works, where it came from. Instead of stepping closer to use her blade on Anova, Lotharia stood there. She wasn't sure what the Fae was searching for in her face, but she seemed to have found it when she lowered her weapon. You'll not find that here. He had all physical records destroyed, Lotharia said. A look flickered in her eyes, and it was like watching the center of a fire writhe and dance. She was remembering something. Anova stared back at the Fae. Something clicked into place. She knew these things. Or at least she knew more than Anova did about the blood crown. You want to know, Lotharia said when Anova hadn't responded. She stepped forward. Though she'd lowered the sword, Anova didn't relish any Fae this close to her. Prove to me you're more than a sneak thief, Anova. Lotharia turned in one motion and strode for the exit of the archives. She stopped, and without looking back, she said, Convince me you're here to do what you say. Set a date, and make it soon. Chapter 11. Anova's eyes bolted open. The pain was like a light in her brain, bright, merciless, and exacting. A scream tore through her lips before she could clamp down on it. Her body trembled with the burden of it, and she pulled her limbs close like she could hold the pain inside. It felt like someone was trying to pry apart her skull. Anova pulled the crown from her head, but the pain didn't stop. It grew, monstrous and ravenous. She shoved it back on, and her body shuddered. Sarah's voice was at the door. It was high and strained. She'd heard it all. My lady, is something wrong? She must have fallen asleep. Sometime between sneaking back inside her suite and planning for her next steps, her body had taken what it had needed from her. The sunlight was too angled. It was nearly dusk. The memory of what she'd learned in the archives, along with Lotharia's threat, lingered in her mind. She needed to do something about it all. Now. Anova lurched from the too-big bed, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and opened the door to prove that she wasn't getting murdered in her sheets. But instead of showing relief, Sarah's eyes widened at what she saw on Anova's face. Bad dreams. Anova's voice sounded hollow to herself. Sarah's lips pressed together. She still didn't look entirely convinced that Anova wasn't attacked. A thought occurred to Anova then, and she didn't like it. She's no fighter, so that means they intend her to double as a body shield should an assassin make it inside. They would expect her to lay down her life before mine. Sarah spoke again, disrupting Anova's morbid thoughts. The feast will be in an hour, my lady. Please allow me to prepare you for it. Anova narrowed her eyes at nothing in particular. Feast? To celebrate the announcement of your engagement, Sarah said. Most of Fae will be there, I imagine. Anova felt like she was going to throw up. How had the bastard organized all this within less than 24 hours? Anova sat and allowed Sarah to do what she wanted with her, though only after Sarah had insisted that she should do something. As she brushed and pinned parts of her hair to her head around the blood crown, Anova allowed the details of what she'd learned to coalesce within her. She needed to get back to the human lands as soon as possible. There was no way around it. And she needed a reason that wouldn't arouse Hellmyr's suspicions or tip him off as to what was so important there. Because the real reason that the High King had wanted to invade the human lands was to ensure the Blood Crown could never be destroyed. That was where the last hope of destroying it was. The descendant of the witch who had created the Blood Crown. The last human with magic. The last witch. During his conquest, he'd planned to root out this person and kill them. The proof of it all had been written plainly among his war notes. Anova sagged in her chair. At least she'd been able to destroy the papers. Her next steps were plain before her. Convince Hellmyr that she needed to go back to Urbess and set a date for their wedding. Anova shivered at the thought of being tied to him in such a way. It's only a front. I'll set it for a month from now. She seemed to be pushing a lot of obligations out lately, but her first priority over most anything else was living. And if she didn't, well, that was one less thing to worry about. And she'd done this before, even if under different circumstances. Her stomach twisted at the thought of him. Sarah helped her into her dress, a low-cut, gauzy black one with a slit along the leg. It would have been stunning if she weren't wearing it solely to tie her life with that of a fey monster. A knock sounded at the door to her suite. It was time. When she entered the hall, Sarah beside her in a beautiful fey-made dress of her own, she couldn't help but draw the parallels between this night and the last one that she'd been here. The tables spread across the hall were filled with steaming food. Above them, night had fallen already, and the soft light of the stars brightened the room through the sky window. Moonrise would happen soon if it hadn't yet. As the train of servants guided her to her seat, Hellmyr and his guards entered at the same time. She scowled. Of course, Hellmyr was in a black coat and suit that matched her dress. It was trimmed in gleaming silver, and on his head was a crown of the same color that must have been made to mirror hers. They were a matching pair, or so he certainly wanted them all to believe. Anova felt their eyes on her as she took her seat. The smell of the roasted chicken near her made her mouth water. She tried to ignore their stares, but it was becoming difficult. Most of them weren't at the battle in the Boundary Forests. Perhaps they didn't know what happened there. Or they thought it was a rumor. And there was the fact that never before had a human worn the blood crown. She felt when Hellmyr sat beside her at the head of the long feast table. He was within arm's reach, though she didn't look at him. It was tiring being his doll and figurehead all in one. I'll need to convince him soon that I need to go to Urbess. Now wasn't the time, but she didn't have time to begin with. Suddenly, a commotion erupted at one end of the feast table. A fae stood with a feral look in his eyes. "Right there! Somebody kill it! It's not meant to have it!" Hellmyr stood so quickly that his chair fell against the floor. "Kill him," he growled. A flurry of guards carried out his will. They held the fae against the ground, but she could still see him. His eyes were on her. Silver starlight glinted off a blade, and the fae was freed of his head. Anova could feel the bloodlust rise in the room. Eyes flickered between her and the dead fae. "Anyone else care to be relieved of a head?" Hellmyr said with a dangerous look in his eyes. Silence fell upon the room. He stood before his seat. "An attack on my bride is an attack on me. Misinterpret that to your folly." Murmurs broke out among the feast tables as they realized what his words meant. Hellmyr took his seat. Moonlight fell around him, highlighting his almost violet-toned black hair. He looked every part an angry fae king. "Anova is to be your queen. For the first time in ages, you will have a high king and high queen. Together, We will be stronger than any Fae ruler our history has known. Fae will be stronger." He waited until the furor dissolved. After a moment, he added, "We will combine our houses in 2 weeks under the full moon." The words echoed within Anova's skull. 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Her gaze shot to Lotharia, her lip curling already. "You couldn't wait for me to prove myself, is that so? You set the date yourself." Anova cursed the Fae lady for interfering, but then again, that's what the Fae did best. But she noticed a strange thing then. Lotharia didn't look the part of a self-satisfied cat who ate the mouse. Instead, she looked approving. Her mouth moved quickly, almost too quick for Anova to read her lips. But it was clear enough to her. "You've done well." Anova could feel her brow wrinkling. Lotharia didn't do this, and she thought that Anova had selected the date. Her gaze shot to the Fae King next to her. He had said more words to his gathered court and allowed them to start eating. Sarah was testing Anova's food, as was Hellmyr's servant doing for him. He waited, almost bored, for his taster to finish chewing a glistening piece of meat seasoned with lemon pepper. She whispered to him, "Had enough of waiting, have you?" Hellmyr's eyes swept to hers as he smirked, his sharp teeth showing. "My dear, you'll find human moralities have little influence here. Whatever waiting you're suggesting doing, there's no need. You may come to my chambers whenever you wish." Anova's face reddened. "You know of what I speak," she grinded out. "I'm afraid I don't," he said, turning his head to bite into a plum that resembled the shade of her face. She stared at him. "The full moon is 2 weeks away?" The Fae King's eyes flicked back to hers. "Your servant spoke like you knew that." "My servant?" "Sarah?" she said in a whisper. Her throat closed around the name. "Why would she?" He shook his head ever so slightly. "One of the others." He narrowed his eyes at her. "What are you saying?" "Nothing. I just..." She chewed her lip. What did it mean? "I'll have one of them find me a more current moon calendar." She started to eat the food placed in front of her, but she couldn't taste it despite knowing how mouth-watering Fae food was. The muscles in her jaws moved without her directing them to. What was going on? Hellmyr hadn't decided it. Someone else had set their wedding date so close. But who? More importantly, why? She had more enemies than she'd known. There were other players in this game, and she hadn't even realized it. The hand holding her fork had started to shake. She clamped down on her bottom lip and speared the meat on her plate. She couldn't expose her vulnerabilities. Someone else was out there, watching, pulling strings that she hadn't realized were attached to her limbs. Someone needed them to be wed on the full moon. Did someone else know she was to die so soon? Anova breathed. Hellmyr was staring at her, watching. Perhaps he'd already pieced it together. Someone was among them, pulling them along like puppets. She couldn't let him know her true intentions. She needed to act already. The words passed between her lips, soft and fast. "Is that offer good for tonight?" His response was a smile that showed his teeth again. "For you it is." Chapter 12. Anova's heart thundered inside her chest so much that she felt dizzy. She stopped when her guards came to a set of wide doors illuminated on either side by wall sconces. Reminding herself why she was here and what she needed to accomplish helped move her feet through them, but it did nothing for her heart. But when she walked inside his chambers, They were empty. After the guard closed the doors, Anova walked around the first room. The fact that she was alone couldn't placate her heart, not when she considered this would be the perfect time for an assassination. She swallowed. What she was trying to do here now seemed the epitome of foolish. Trying to seduce a disturbed Fae king into letting her return to the human lands without tipping him off to the real reason. Well, she'd done more difficult things. Hadn't she? 1 month left. 1 month left. It kept her feet moving. You've done this plenty of times with Juris's help. She closed her eyes and envisioned that Hellmyr was no more than her drunk mark in a tavern. She even saw the gold jewelry and coins that she would steal from him. When she opened her eyes, she realized that on the other side of the room was a balcony. The glass and metal door was ajar, and a warm breeze leaked into the room from it. She held her breath and passed through it. "I knew it was only a matter of time," he said. He was propped against a lounge chair, letting the moonlight fall on his skin and highlight the planes of his bare chest. Thankfully, he was wearing pants, because Anova wasn't sure what she would have done otherwise. Beside him on a low table was a glass of what looked like human-made wine. Her mouth popped open. The smell of grapes and earth hit her. It was human-made. "Do you want some?" Hellmyr's grackle eyes took her in. She hadn't changed from the gauzy dress she'd worn to the dinner. Her tongue danced inside her mouth for the thought of something from her home, but she thought better of it and refused him. She needed a clear head for this. Her eyes darted to his waist. There was nothing there, no weapon. But then again, she could always try to throw him off the balcony if she needed to. "Fond of balconies, are you?" she asked. "And of showing off, and generally being full of yourself." He shrugged. "One of the improvements here I made upon becoming king." She tapped her foot. "I need to speak with you, alone." Anova looked pointedly out across the land. While the landscape of East Woe was undeniably beautiful with its autumnal forests and lanterns glowing like will-o-wisps in the night, this was surely less private than speaking inside, even if they were high in the air. Hellmyr's palm faced the moon, and a small light flashed in his hand before disappearing. A shimmer danced on the air before he faced her again. "It was already spelled for wayward arrows, in case you were wondering." She suppressed a shudder. Attacks on her life had become mundane to her now, which oddly bothered her more than the idea of being attacked. His eyes were still on her. "If you're tired of standing, you can sit." Anova crossed her arms, glaring at his reclining form. "You're taking up the only—" She shut her mouth just as quickly. That's his point. She should be doing better at this, she felt, but this Fae had a way of bringing out the worst in her. "Fine," she said between her teeth. Before she could convince herself not to, she sat down on his lap, bringing her legs across his so she was perched sideways on him. She crossed her legs together as the breeze ruffled her dress. "I'm the one using him," she reminded herself. "Then I can be quit of him as I like." Hellmyr watched her, saying nothing, blessedly. He didn't even shift his weight under her. The plan she'd worked so hard to concoct during dinner sat in her mind, but her lips were pressed tight together. As she mulled over the words that she'd used to convince him of what she wanted, she started tracing the divots and hills of his hard chest. As quickly as a bolt of lightning, one of his hands grabbed hers, stopping her where she'd coaxed out a line of goosebumps. He brought his mouth to her ear. "You're here to seduce me, aren't you?" He breathed against her neck. "Then do it already." Anova swallowed. "What are you talking about?" "I can tell when you want something. It gets in your eyes. he murmured. His sudden, barking laugh surprised her. It must be important for you to stoop to this. Perhaps it's the real reason you came here. But something rose in Anova like a wave. She didn't realize what it was until she started speaking. You should care that I'm using you, she said with a bite to her voice. She pulled herself up from him. This was the densest thing she could say to him, but something inside her wouldn't keep it bottled up when he acted like this. She felt as if her heart were being throttled. She could barely breathe for the anger that consumed her. He was the Fae King. He was the only thing holding these feral creatures back from Bedlam. And he'd let her in knowing she had intents other than what he wanted. Murderous, traitorous intents. You should care, she repeated, her frantic heartbeat barely allowing her to speak. But you don't. His mouth was on hers before she could understand what had happened. Her fingers found the back of his neck to pull him closer to her. Sometime, her legs had moved so she'd started to straddle him. Kissing Hellmyr was like falling into darkness. Adrenaline rushed her body, but she let herself fall deeper. One of his hands found her back where her dress surrendered to bare skin, and he traced shapes into her skin that made her shiver. Heat rose inside her like the plume of a wildfire and spread through her veins. Hellmyr pressed his mouth against her throat. The fire continued through her, and she arched herself against him. Against her throat, his voice rumbled through her. Why is it that you came back to me? Because I'm dying. Because I need help and there was no one else. But instead of those things, those horrid, ugly, truthful things, she murmured into the cool night. Don't ask. If she were going to die anyway, what did it matter who knew? She didn't want his pity, but she wanted this. You will tell me, he said against her skin. The haze lifted from her mind as she breathed in fresh air. No, she needed to do something here. She was going to live, and she'd better start acting like it. She needed to remember that. His mouth had moved to other places, and she tried to keep her voice even as she spoke. I need to go back to the human lands. Hellmyr stopped and looked up at her. Darling, I don't know if you've noticed, but you tend to stick out as you are. I don't think they'll allow the one crowned with that to walk around. Not after recent events. His lips formed a startling smile at a new thought. Unless, of course, you wish to invade and start your reign over those lands as well. Something bubbled up her throat at the thought. No, she blurted. We are not invading Urbes. Hellmyr shrugged. As you wish. I personally agree. We need only target the humans' corrupt old king in order to take control of those lands. Her teeth grinded against one another, and she pulled away from him. We are not taking control of the human lands. Something flashed in Hellmyr's eyes at those words, and she amended them with, Not right now. No, I just need to take care of some business there. Hellmyr's gaze narrowed on her. Business? I have some associates who are in debt to their employer. She chewed at her lip as she decided whether or not to tell him more. Juris, and the women who were my mother's friends. I want to pay off their debts so they can leave. It was the truth. She wanted to help them get out of the Rosebud since she'd escaped it. Now that she had the power to do so, she would seize the opportunity. And Juris, she hadn't seen him since she'd murdered the High King. She needed to make sure he was free of Hinterfell. It also happened to be the perfect cover for her to find the last human witch. As Hellmyr opened his mouth to surely say no, He said something else instead.
I'll get you past the boundary and even into the city undercover, but only if you do something for me as well. I'll make a deal with you.
She didn't like the sound of this, but she figured she should have expected no less. What is it? She asked. But Hellmyr wasn't looking at her. He was examining one of her hands. She felt something cold, and she slid her hand out of his before something could happen to it. When she saw what was on it, her stomach dropped. Ah, there's my new problem.
Wear this, he said.
It was a silver ring that wrapped perfectly around her finger. On it was a heavy onyx gem, cut so its facets collected the light around it. There was no other word for it. It was beautiful. And it was a reminder of what was quickly becoming one of her biggest problems, second only to her death coming in less than a month. Her engagement to this fae. There's always a catch to fae bargains. Chapter 13. The last light of the day streaked through the trees of the boundary forests. Anova leaned towards her horse. She couldn't quite believe how painless it had proven to convince Hellmyr of this whole operation. She snuck a glance down at her hands holding the horse's reins. That's because I paid a price for it. She steadied herself. It would be worth it to see the blood crown destroyed. Anova concealed her smile. It was a demented smile, but something in her took joy from the thought. No matter if I can save myself or not, it will be destroyed for good. Ahead of her, Hellmyr signaled for their party to stop. Anova could feel the tension in the air. The magic of fae fought against the neutrality on the other side of the boundary. They descended their mounts, and she walked to where she knew the invisible barrier to be. Just like last time, she felt the intangible block before them. This needed to work, or else she would be stuck in fae until she died. Hellmyr's violet-black eyes beheld her. A smile quirked to his lips as she approached.
Ordinarily, feats of magic performed by the wearer of the blood crown are difficult to reverse.
Anova narrowed her eyes at him. She hadn't done this, but she didn't interrupt. All that mattered was that they could pass through it. Hellmyr continued.
But in this case, a little assistance will suffice to lift the spell.
He held his hand out towards her. Anova frowned but came forward to clasp his in her hand. She felt his thumb run over the onyx of her ring before they proceeded. She bit the inside of her cheek. Fae were obsessed with ownership and possessing. Anova felt the rush of warmth spread through her, going all the way to her ends. She breathed slowly, trying not to panic at the feeling of magic invading her limbs. With his other hand, he drew magic from the moon in his palm. It was as light as water as it collected in the creases of his skin. A ripple in the air formed, and it reminded Anova of how light bent in water. With her breath held, they walked through the ripple together. The air clung to her oddly as she stepped through to what she knew was the human realm. She tried to breathe normally, but a pressure held tight to her chest. She swallowed. You'll be fine here. This is your home. But why did it feel so different now? As soon as the last of his guards were through, Hellmyr dropped his hand, and she pulled hers back to herself. The ripple was gone. Hellmyr stepped to where it had been, his hand before him. He made a noise and turned back to her.
It's closed again.
Before her heart could jump out of her throat, he added,
I should be able to open it to go back, but it'll need to happen while the moon is out. I'll be waiting here. Don't be late.
Hellmyr sniffed in the general direction of Urbess like he could smell the stink of the city. He probably can, she reminded herself. Fine by me, she said, her arms crossing. I'll be back before the night is over. She turned to lead her horse out of this side of the boundary forests, but Hellmyr stopped her, blocking her path with his body. I may be staying here, but your guards are coming with you. Besides, I need to glamour all of you before you go. She looked back at the retinue of guards he'd dragged here. There must have been a dozen or so of them. She'd assumed they'd been for him. She gawked at him. No less than 12 fully armed fae, most of which were pure sculpted muscle. She turned to look back at Hellmyr. There's no way we can sneak through the human lands like this. Even with fae glamour, they're too noticeable. Some of them had started to glare back at her. She didn't care. Hellmyr took a step closer to her. You're taking them, or you're not going at all. Anova felt a vein pop against her temple. The constables will stop us as soon as we pass into the city. There's too many. I work best by myself. For her plan, one fae guard was too many, but he didn't know that. Hellmyr closed his eyes and breathed. His voice lowered. I'm coming, or they are. Her heart raced. She couldn't have that at all. Short of killing him, there would be no fooling him as to her true motivations once she got farther in. His eyes opened again. He surely could hear her frantic heart, and she needed to say something to distract him from it. One. I'll take one of them. You'll take 2. Hellmyr looked back at them and pulled 2 from the group, a male and female guard. They went to work glamouring themselves. Out of her peripherals, she watched their ears round from points. Even their brutal beauty softened. They became human-like, though she thought she'd have been able to tell if she looked hard enough. Her mind raced ahead of her as she allowed Hellmyr to disguise the crown on her head with fae magic. How am I going to lose them? They didn't look particularly thrilled that he'd chosen them out of the rest. In fact, she'd have said they looked bored. I'll just have to find a way out of their supervision. She'd bet her life that Hellmyr had intended just that for these fae. Not just as her guards, but as watchful eyes on her. Before dawn. Don't be late, he reminded her as they mounted their horses once more. She rolled her eyes. It helped with the tension tangled in her gut. I wouldn't dare. With one fae guard on either side of her, they rode through the rest of the boundary forests. From the help of the steeds bred in fae, they were on the outside of Urbess well before she'd perfected a plan. They left their horses at the edge of the forest and slipped into the city's shadows like wraiths. She should have felt at home here, but all she felt was unease. I need to start driving us to the other side of Urbess where the hills are. In her mind, she envisioned a map of the city. Where she needed to go was on the opposite side, where the city surrendered to foothills that eventually gave way to more coast. That was where the last witch was said to reside. She hoped this person still lived. Anova crouched by a crate pushed against a warehouse. She'd come as close to the rosebud as possible without veering off path from her first destination. How she would do all this in one night would be a miracle, but she only had tonight. She felt them behind her in the shadows. It was now or never. Anova whispered behind her. I'm going to the south side of Urbess first. There's something I have to take care of there. No plan, no tricks, just a command. But her fae guards weren't looking at her. They'd glanced at each other, and Anova tried to interpret the strange, fleeting look before it was gone. It was then they attacked. Silver flames filled their palms, writhing and alive. Anova slammed herself against the other corner of the crate as she dodged their fireballs. Her nails dug into her hands. What were they doing? All fae are bastards, remember. Anova dodged another of their assaults before pulling free the weapon she'd taken with her upon leaving Eastwoe. But a blade was little defense against Fey magic. She swore out loud. "You give us all away with your ill-thought-out treason," she said through her teeth. She pushed herself against another crate. The female guard leaped in front of her, her eyes gleaming. "If it means we kill you and gain the crown, so be it." The heat of her flames grazed Anova's skin, and she rolled under her to dodge the worst of it. She ran. They were being far worse than reckless. This was deranged. Flames blasted the street ahead of her. Anova turned around, her weapon raised. The male had his hands behind his back. A smile as sharp as a dagger bolted to his face, highlighting his cheekbones.
"It should go to a Fey, one who can use its power."
Even human, he was much too beautiful. His eyebrows raised in question.
"Don't you agree?"
Anova bit her tongue. No one deserved the unrestrained power that came with such an artifact. The female joined him. Her eyes were much more cunning than his, and in her palm already was a dagger. If Anova had to bet, this Fey was planning on killing the other once she killed Anova. I don't have time for any of this. She was on the streets she'd been raised on. It was time to fight dirty. Suddenly, Anova raised her hands to the sky and looked at a point just past their shoulders. Her eyes widened, and her voice was tight with pleading when she spoke. "They're Fey," she gasped. "They tried kidnapping me. Please, arrest them." As soon as their backs twisted to look behind them, Anova ran, jumping over the dying flames in the street. There were no constables. It was one of the oldest tricks known to the street rats here. She smiled to herself, and she started for the route that would hide her best in this city. Chapter 14. Anova's feet were sore and blistered in her boots, but she couldn't stop. She'd already passed the area in which the High King's war notes had claimed the last witch lived. Trees shifted, and she glimpsed the sliver of moon overhead. She prayed the night would be long enough. Through the last of the trees that bordered Urbes on its south and west sides, Anova came to rolling fields scattered here and there with more tree clusters. It was undeniably the most beautiful part of the land this side of the boundary. It looked empty, but a quiet tug that started in her stomach told her otherwise. The witch was here. Anova started forward, listening to how the grass bending against themselves was like a chorus. The sky above her was clear except for puffs of clouds that raced under the moon crescent like children. How far does this deception go? Now that she was far from their flames and the streets she'd been cornered on, she considered which was worse. If her guards had acted independently, or if they had something to do with the servant who had told Hellmyr that their wedding date was to be in 2 weeks. Either way, it wasn't good. At once, the ground fell away from her, and her stomach twisted itself into a tight knot. The world was a blur of motion and color as she fell. It wasn't until she stopped moving that Anova realized that she hadn't fallen. Or rather, she hadn't fallen down. The breeze stirring the grass made her sway. She was hanging from a loop of rope around her ankles that was tied to a tree branch. As she tried to bend herself up to reach her ankles, she discovered that her arms wouldn't budge. Anova cursed. When she'd been flipped over, her hands had caught a loop of rope that had tightened as a part of the trap. The rope stretched her too tightly for her to be able to move. How had she not seen it before? Rocks and leaves had hidden the trap. She'd let her guard down, and she'd paid for it. I don't have time for this. Her teeth grinded against each other. All her things were on the ground below her, including the blood crown that had been on top of her head. Anova's nails dug into the rope at her wrists. Her circulation already suffered for it, but it was the surest way out. It was then she heard the ticking noise. It reminded her of a wooden clock, which was why she'd ignored it at first. The first sign of blood crown madness was always auditory and visual hallucinations. But it's usually far more insistent, she thought. Anova looked ahead at the upside-down land around her and stopped moving. It was well hidden inside a bramble bush, but there was no mistaking it now that the clicking was all that she could hear. It most resembled a bow gun, though she'd never seen one quite like this. Attached to one end of it was a wooden dial that clicked on its own at regular intervals. Like a clock, she realized. Her next thought came a second later. It's counting down. And aimed straight at her heart was an arrow with a deadly metal tip. This was the point of the trap. Not only to capture, but to kill as well. It's an illusion, nothing more. It's the crown. But the blood thundering through her veins told her otherwise. It's real, it's real, it's real. You can't afford to find out if it's real or not. Her vision danced before her eyes, swirling to the beat of the timer. The blood had gathered in her head and hands. She couldn't move. Don't give up. Her extremities had numbed by now, but Anova couldn't stop. Her nails barely pierced the thick rope, and she swayed with the movement of her frenzied attempts. It wasn't working. There wasn't anything she could do. Her heart stuttered, pumping more blood like it knew the sharp metal would soon be inside of it. I can't do anything. It hit her like a punch to the gut. That was the point. Rather than automatically release the arrow when the trap's prey was still unaware of it, a timer had been affixed to the trigger. But why? To allow the hunter to come and investigate his kill. She blinked. For the prey to beg for its life. This was either the work of a sadist or... When she spoke, her voice was unnaturally high. I'm not here to hurt you. Please, I need your help. The calm breeze mocked her, pulling at her binds. Between the ticking noise, silence was heavy on the plains. I can't die yet. I'm trying to destroy it. She didn't like the sound of her own voice, but she was sure no one was listening anyway. If I knew that dying would destroy it, I would gladly die. But I don't. Her memories showed her the first time she'd decided that her life was worth trading to destroy the crown. It hadn't worked then. Not anymore, she said through her teeth. The ticking was louder than ever. But no matter what it takes, I vow to do it. Her heartbeat was so loud for several seconds that she didn't realize the ticking sound had stopped. Anova blinked through her distorted vision. There was a hooded figure standing in the brambles. It was one last illusion from the crown before she died. Except this illusion stepped forward, pulled her hood back, and revealed a face she shouldn't have recognized. She'd never seen her before, but it was like she'd seen her in a dream years ago. Her hair was pulled away from her face in a loose braid. She was young, perhaps just a year shy of adulthood or even a year into it. Anova felt her dark brown eyes missed nothing. You're the witch, Anova said. The last one. The witch's eyes tightened at the edges. And you have a glamour on you. She closed the distance between them. As quick as a snake, her hand slipped into her pocket and out again. Loosened from between her fingers, she spread something over Anova in a wide spray. She spat out the pieces that had landed on her mouth. Anova looked at the witch with incredulousness. Salt? The young witch thumbed at her closed mouth. You're still human. Her eyes raked over Anova's hanging form. But what were you hiding? Her gaze caught at something among Anova's possessions, and she lurched backward, her hand in her knapsack like she was about to spill a load of salt on the ground. Anova could guess what she'd seen. The blood crown. It seemed to trigger Anova's pain of removing the blood crown. She winced as it begged to be fixed atop her head again. Soon, she said to herself, soothing the cursed thing below her that was also inside her head. The witch's teeth were gritted together, and her eyes flicked from the cursed crown to Anova hanging in her trap. Her hand remained in her bag. Each word the witch spoke was like stones scraping against stone. Why do you have that? Anova endeavored to make her voice as even as possible, despite the fact that she was hanging upside down and covered in salt. By rights, I am its owner. The witch's deep brown eyes stared at Anova. Her voice was a hoarse whisper. You killed their king, and yet... Her gaze narrowed by the smallest degree. Why are you here? As I said, I want to destroy it. For good. For several seconds, the witch's gaze was fixed on her. The breeze stirred the grasses again and lifted a strand on the witch's brown hair. As she stepped close to Anova again, she braced herself for more salt. Instead, the binds at her hands loosened. The witch stretched to untie the rope at Anova's feet, and her palms smacked against the ground as she was lowered to the earth with the help of the one who had set the trap. At once, Anova shoved the crown against her head, and she nearly sagged as the pain sapped away from her body. She took several moments to breathe and massage the skin at her wrists and ankles. The stranger watched her in silence, waiting for her to collect her things. Clearly, there was no apology forthcoming for nearly killing her moments ago, and Anova didn't expect one. This girl's existence had been the sole reason for the High King's war on humans. She had to be aware of the threat she posed to Fae, even if she wasn't aware of what had nearly befallen the human lands. In a similar situation, Anova would have taken the same precautions. Anova stepped towards her when she was done gathering her things. I came here to find you, she swallowed. It was time to face something she'd buried for a long while. And I came to find out if it can be destroyed, if the curse can be broken. The witch girl looked from the glistening fey crown on her head back to her face before turning away from Anova. Come, we'll go to my cabin. Her eyes went to the tree line of the forest at the edge of the plains. On nights when the moon is out, even the trees have ears. Chapter 15. The witch's cabin was only a short distance away from her fatal trap, but it was well hidden. The air smelled wet, and Anova guessed they were near the coast. Moss soaked every surface in sight, especially a great oak that had a thick trunk. Its branches spread to the sky like fingers. She didn't realize until the witch stopped that this was her cabin. Or rather, the witch's cabin was almost indistinguishable from the tree's wide girth. Moss covered it as well, except for glass windows that seemed to have been tinted green from the breath of the plants around it. It was pushed against the tree so that the oak's roots looked to be part of the cabin's foundation. Birds had nested on the roof, and they picked at their feathers at the sight of Anova. She squinted back at them, just as suspicious. The witch stretched to reach above her doorframe. A rope fell away, freely hanging from a close branch until she looped it around it once more. Anova reminded herself not to touch anything of the witch's. She hadn't seen that one either. After Anova walked inside, the witch turned and sprinkled salt at the threshold. She wanted to ask for some. Hellmyr's face sprang to her mind, but they had more serious matters to speak of. And there's only so much of the night left. But before she could say anything about the blood crown, Anova couldn't help noticing something. Her gaze drifted across the interior of her cabin. In one corner was a single, wide bed. Quilts with frayed edges were piled on top of it. The table in her kitchen was loaded with dried leaves, bottled liquids, more salt, flowers, and books. Even more books lined the shelf near her bed, some with covers that were falling away from their pages. While the witch removed her shoes, Anova noticed another pair of worn boots sitting near the door. The soles were nearly detached, and they had been scuffed to the point that Anova was unsure of their original color. Anova held the witch girl's gaze. "How long have you been alone here?" The witch froze, her lips tight against each other. "You don't." Lotharia's words came to Anova then, and she quoted the Fey lady. "Like recognizes like." The witch looked away from her. 10 years, or so. Anova steadied herself against the back of the single chair propped against the kitchen table. The calculations were simple. She'd been just a child when she'd been left alone. Anova didn't know anything about her other than the fact that she was the descendant of the original witch in the Fey tale and the last living human with magic. But this, she recognized. When the witch spoke again, her voice was quiet. "What about you? How long has it been?" Anova counted the years back in her head. Too long, she wanted to say, but her mouth said, 5 years. 5 years since she had lost her mother. Anova added after that moment, "They killed her. They came here and killed her themselves." The witch was looking at the crown again. "So that's why. That's why you risked death to kill the High King and destroy their crown." In truth, it was one of many reasons. But how could she admit that she'd done it mostly to save the life of a Fae who thought of her as nothing but a useful tool? The words soured on her tongue. The witch met her gaze once more. "My name is Alice. You're right. I am the last of the witches and descendant of Gwenor, the human who helped make that." "Anova," she said in offering. She wasn't sure where else to start. Alice shed the last of her boots and coat as she said in response to Anova's unspoken question. 10 years ago, they found my mother and killed her. They thought that our line was ended then, and with her death, they thought to preserve their cursed power." Anova's heart raced faster than her words. "But they found out about you, didn't they? A glimpse. A rumor was leaked." She swallowed. "You were in the High King's war notes." Alice's head snapped up from where she'd been going through her knapsack. "War notes. War," she repeated dully. Anova gritted her teeth. There was much ground to cover here, but she didn't have the time. Bess didn't have the time. Hellmyr would unleash hell on the human city if she wasn't safely back before dawn. She had little doubt of it. Anova stepped forward, avoiding the creeping vine that dominated the space under a green-tinted window. "What do you know about the Blood Crown?" Her voice was tight. "I need your help to end this. I need to know if it can be ended." The witch's hands hovered around the crown, and her gaze turned empty. At once, she stepped back several paces. "My mother told me stories, but its evil is so plainly felt." Alice's words came out like a hiss. "As is its power." Alice's chest rose up and down frantically, and Anova noticed that her hands were blistered around the pads. The crown had burned her. Anova stepped forward. "Your hands." "Yet despite all its pure Fey power, what made it so was the curse and blessing of witch magic." Her eyes were bright on it. "What was made can be unmade, even if such a thing can only be destroyed by what brought it into existence." Alice's smile was exultant. "With this, we will destroy the line of their kings and queens." Anova couldn't believe it. She wanted to, but she couldn't allow herself to be so easily lured by the relief. She closed her eyes. How? What will it require? When Alice didn't respond, she opened her eyes. The witch was staring fixedly at her books, occasionally looking back to the crown. Anova frowned. She knew that look. Before it became the blood crown, it was just a crown, a token of the reigning Fey monarch's power, Alice explained. The problem, of course, is the witch magic within it. While the wearer is cursed to be hunted by rivals and assassins, the witch magic imbued in it also gives them power unlike what most Fae can harness by moonlight. It's a power warped by the hate, grief, and blood loss that crafted the curse in the first place. It's what makes their position of power so covetable. Her lips pursed together. Alice added, I can't be sure yet, but what should destroy it would be another ritual by a witch, one to nullify the one that created it. Anova exhaled. It made too much sense not to be true. Only a witch should have been capable of destroying what had been created by one, and the High King had been desperate to kill the last witch, desperate enough to start a war between their kind. This was the answer. She felt it in her bones. How much time will you need to find the right ritual? Anova's pulse raced. Alice tilted her head to one side. A few days, at least. Her eyes went to her bed, her lips tight. I'll make a room for you, should you decide to stay here rather than trek back every day. Anova's stomach twisted into knots. She didn't have days to come back. She had one night in the human lands. I have to go back tonight. Back to Faye. Anova took a step towards her. Come with me. I'll help you find the answer. We'll destroy it together. Alice's brown eyes were fixed on her. She hadn't moved. You're going back there. After what they've done. Her voice was coated in slick bitterness. I have to. Anova clenched her teeth. How much could she reveal to this witch? There's a Fae who will raze Urbess to the ground if I don't return before dawn. And the first place where he'd look for her? The rosebud. Anova's stomach lurched. Anova added, breaking the silence. And there are people who I need to return to, depending on me. Alice didn't respond. She only stared at her and the crown atop her head that shouldn't have been there. She didn't have time for this. Her life depended on Alice's help, but others were in danger now because of her lies. Maybe she could fail herself, but she couldn't fail them. Anova left. Chapter 16. Her body and mind were numb as she ran. Anova tried not to think of what she'd left behind in that cabin. She would have to do this by herself, as she always had. Not when I was with Juris, though. The reminder of him drove her forward. At least this crown would be good for something. It was a long time coming, but she could finally pay off their debt to that vile woman for both her and Juris. And even if she was doomed to die, she could at least free her closest friend from their past. She chewed on her lip as she ran. Would he still be at the home they'd once shared? Anova didn't have time to look anywhere else. He had to be there. Against her will, she recalled those harrowing moments in the border forests. She'd coerced Juris into helping her poison the High King, thereby poisoning herself. After she remained conscious long enough to see the Fey King afflicted with it, Anova had fallen ill from the wolf's bane to the point of death. That was the last we saw of each other. He likely thinks he helped kill me. As she flew through the streets, she knew she had no time. The night's shadows were already dissipating from their corners and nooks. Dawn was less than an hour away. She smelled the bakery before she saw it. The aroma of rising bread filled her like it was solid food. Mara's already up. I'll have to be quiet. Her footsteps were noiseless, an impressive feat when she scaled the barely attached metal staircase that led to their attic home above the bakery. The door was locked, but it was hardly a challenge as she jimmied the familiar mechanism. As it opened, Anova pressed into the shadows of their shared single room, his name in her throat. It was empty. Or rather, it was empty of him. Their belongings remained, left behind like ghosts in the corners. Clothes, trinkets, blankets, and knives were all where she'd remembered them. Would he have left this here if he relocated? The question hung in her mind, alone like she was. It was a possibility, if he were being hunted by the constables or worse. She noticed it then. The note was neatly folded and placed on Juris's trunk. She read it once, twice, and a third time before crumpling it in her fist. If you're reading this, you know he's mine now, but I'm open to trades. H. Anova didn't think. There wasn't room for it within the storm that had started inside of her. There was no way for her to know how long the note had been here. She left what had once been their home as noiselessly as she'd broken inside it. Anova crouched low. She was within sight of the rosebud. She licked her teeth. This night hadn't come soon enough. For a handful of seconds, Anova seriously debated killing her before conceding to the fact that it would have been far too much hassle tonight. Without having to scout it out, she knew the fastest and quietest way to sneak inside. She'd been doing it until she was 12 or so. Anova shimmied up the gutter, hanging halfway off the side of the building for support. Even though she knew where to step to avoid creaks, they were inevitable. Anova hoped that whoever was inside attributed it to the wind. As she came to the part of the sloping roof where she knew the window was, she crouched, hung on to the side of the establishment, and shoved it open as quickly as possible. Anova lowered herself to the window ledge, balanced on it for less than a second, and climbed inside. Her stomach lurched to acknowledge it, but she knew that the building had been designed so that the windows were too high to reach from the ground. Anova clung to the inside of the window ledge for a moment before carefully lowering herself to the ground of the empty room. It wasn't empty. Anova turned fast enough to make herself dizzy. One of the figures on the bed rose from the shadows and approached. When the candle light hit her face, Anova held back a gasp. She was in the woman's arms a moment later. "Anova, is that really you?" Della whispered in her ear. "Yes," she whispered back. "Yes, it's me." When they pulled apart, Anova's eyes went to the bed. "Is he?" Della smothered her laugh with the hand. "Paid for the whole night. Fell asleep within an hour." Anova smiled back at her. Della and Maris had been her mother's closest friends. She'd missed them. "You've grown so much," Della was saying. She frowned as she saw Anova better. "Are you eating enough? What is—" Anova stepped back. She'd forgotten to pull her hood up around her crown. Her stomach dropped at the expression on Della's face. "Anova, where did you get that?" Her wide eyes focused on her face. "What's going on?" She had a job to do here. She had to start moving or she would be late. "Della, where is Juris?" She took Della by the shoulders. "I need to find his room." "Anova, what?" Della seemed to settle on answering her question rather than getting out the dozens of questions she must have had. "He's not here. I haven't seen him since the two of you stopped paying her off." Anova stared back at her. A sour feeling rose in her stomach. She had to leave. Now. Somewhere, Della continued to speak. Anova, what's going on? Are you in trouble? At that, Anova's fingers dug through her bag for the coins. I can't stay to explain. I'm not in any trouble, but I can't stay. She found them and fished them out. I'm buying you and Maris out. Here. She shoved the golden coins into Della's arms. Crown pieces gleamed in the candlelight. Della's jaw looked like it had unhinged from the rest of her skull. It was more than enough to pay for Della and Maris's debts and for both of them to start a new life somewhere, courtesy of the new Fae King's treasury. Her mother's friend looked at her. Anova. I have to go. There's no time left, Anova said as she backed up towards the window. Won't you stay, Anova? Della hadn't spoken. In the doorway of Della's rooms was the person she'd dreamt of killing more than any other, including the High King. Madame Hinterfell. Beside her materialized her favorite hired muscle, Strago and Brawn. Hinterfell's gaze went to what was on her head. That's a pretty thing. It'll go toward what you owe me. Several things happened at once. The man who had paid for Della's time ran out of the room with nothing more than a loose shirt on. Della shrieked as Brawn tackled her, and Anova pulled free her sword for the second time that night as Strago tried to do the same to her. Strago stopped before the sight of her steel. Good. She needed to repay him for taking her dagger. She watched as he took it out of a holster at his waist. Her eyes flickered back to his face. She held out her hand. I'd like that back. Instead, he sneered down at her. It stays here now, as you will too soon. Anova gritted her teeth at his words and dodged his quick flurry of stabs. It should be easy to best him with my longer range. She swiped him once along his shoulder. His eyes narrowed at her. She smiled, though it was joyless. I've gotten better from last time, she said. Strago responded with a strike aimed down. Anova deflected it and retaliated with a swing for his other side. Adrenaline soaked her veins. For too long, she'd wanted to do this against the men who had intimidated her mother and her friends. She wanted to scare the men who had hunted her and Juris for the last 5 years. Her tongue ran across her lips. Hurt them, even. A commotion on the other side of the room caught her attention for a second. As she dodged Strago's next blow, 3 others were tangled in a mass of limbs and screams. Get off her, you cretin! Maris was trying to pull Brawn off Della. She must have come when she heard Della scream. Over it all, Madame Hinterfell swore and twitched with anger. Something rose in Anova's chest like a bird soaring through the air. She was winning against Strago, but what was even better was witnessing Strago realize it. His lips pulled back in a toothy snarl, his breath coming in huffs. Despite his realization, he didn't give up. Well, that was fine with her. She was used to opponents much faster and cleverer than this one. She hadn't even broken a sweat yet. Anova's strike cut him again when she heard Madame Hinterfell's voice change among the stream of curses. Her voice was breathy. Wait, I know what this is. She paused and leered at her. You naughty girl. Anova backed up against the wall. Her heart dropped into her stomach. She saw it for what it was. The blood crown, the single most powerful object of the Fae people. What monster did you steal that from? She said with narrowed eyes. Call off your men, Anova said. Or else. She bit the inside of her cheek. This time, she wasn't the thief Hinterfell thought she was. No matter, Hinterfell said. It's worth more than all the lives in this whorehouse anyway. Her fingers snapped. Brawn, Kill the two girls! Anova screamed for them. Maris's face was bruised and bleeding. She'd fought hard against Braun, but it hadn't been enough. He'd pinned both them against the ground, and it was clear they couldn't move against his weight. But somehow, her hand had found Della's. Della had been sobbing from the moment Braun had tried to attack her, but her eyes were clear as they looked to Anova. Anova stared back. She saw a face that she hadn't seen in 5 years except in the nightmares where she died in front of her, where Anova could do nothing but hold her hand as the blood left her body. Anova dropped both objects at once. Together, her sword and the blood crown made an awful clatter against the floor. And then silence flooded the room where there had been nothing but. The pain from separating herself from the crown was instant. A cry came to her lips, but she swallowed it. This was multitudes easier to tolerate than watching her mother's friends die. "Strago," Hinterfell said. It was all the command he needed. He picked up the objects, adding her sword to the growing collection of her weapons at his waist. Anova ignored the screams in the back of her head that was the crown's delirium. She didn't have time for hallucinations when her reality was worse. Sweat dribbled along her back, and she resisted the pain that carved into her body. "Where is Juris?" Anova croaked over the noises inside her head. "Anova, my girl." She hated the familiarity with which Hinterfell said her name. "I've known you your entire life. It's not a hard thing to get you to come back to where you belong." It was a lie. She knew anger was the only rational response to Hinterfell's manipulations, but she couldn't help but feel a twinge of relief flood through her at the realization that Juris hadn't been caught in this net too. Even if she was the fool in the snare. Hinterfell walked forward. Braun had pulled Della and Maris upright. At their feet were the coins she'd intended to use to buy out their debt here. Hinterfell didn't even look at them as she kicked the crown coins with the tips of her boots. The screams became a rhythm in her brain like a hammer against the head of a nail. "Put it back on! Put it back on! Put it back on! Now!" "You should have stayed out of this. This didn't concern you," she said to Maris. All too fast, Madame Hinterfell's hand dove into her cloak and retrieved a blade that curved open. "No!" The scream ripped from Anova's throat. Anova lost track of what happened then as all the world burst into a blinding white. A high-pitched whine lingered in her ears, and a wave of heat pushed against her skin. The smell of burning fat forced into her nostrils, and she coughed it out. As the whiteness thinned into a smog, she blinked against it to see a wide hole in the wall made from the blast. Warm hands found hers and whispered into her ear. "Anova, are you okay?" It was Della. She could barely see her. Her voice was a croak. "Is Maris with you?" "Yes, she is. She's fine as well. Anova, are you okay?" She realized then the reason for Della's question. On the floor near what had been the wall was a mass of what looked to be strange coal. Anova's stomach pushed its contents up into her throat. It was a body. Or it once had been. It was charred beyond recognition now. "Grab Maris," she said with Della's hand tight in hers. Whoever that had been, there was no turning back now. A scream pierced the white-gray miasma that hung in the air. It sounded too human to have been an illusion from the blood crown. When Della returned and squeezed her hand again, Anova pulled the 3 of them forward. The smog was thinning, and they needed to get out before it was gone altogether. Anova stepped over the charred corpse, keeping her gaze as far away from it as possible. They were nearly out, and her lungs begged for clean air. A whistle cried in one of her ears, and a whoosh of air rushed past her. After the three of them contorted themselves through the cracked wood, they ran. Hinterfell's curved blade had landed deep inside the wall next to them. Chapter 17. It was too late already. The new day had broken. Streaks of light painted the ground and buildings around them. Anova, Della, and Maris ran through Urbas, their breaths coming in fits of gusty exhales and inhales. The bakers, smithies, and dock workers were already on the streets, staring at the three of them. It was also too late to worry about Hellmyr. "Where did you get that, Anova?" Maris's dark eyes were on her. Well, not on her face, exactly. Anova's hand flew to the top of her head. It was back. The blood crown was back on her head. Her mouth hung open. She hadn't picked it up. She hadn't even touched it after Strago had picked it up from the floor. There's a lot to explain. Her mouth tasted of ash as she remembered. Her voice was dull. That was Strago, wasn't it? The crown did that. He deserved it, my sweet. Della's hand grazed her upper arm, squeezing it for a second as they ran. Anova nodded. She could feel them looking at her, waiting for an explanation for any of the things that had happened moments ago. Where was she going to take them? They couldn't remain in the city. Hinterfell would make blood sport out of finding them. And what of Juris? If not in Hinterfell's clutches, where was he? She knew in her heart where she had to take them, even if she hated herself for putting them in more danger. "We'll head to the boundary forests. I have horses there, enough for each of us." Her stomach lurched at their expressions. Perhaps they were piecing it together now. The Fey crown, the forests. She was sure she smelled of danger. She swallowed. She owed them an explanation. And a choice. Through gasps, Anova said, "I have some allies waiting for me inside the forests. I'll leave it to you to decide if you wish to follow me there. I should be able to get you to safety after that, away from Hinterfell." They hadn't said anything yet. She added, "I'm truly sorry I brought this upon you both. I never meant for any of this. I just wanted to buy out your debts." "We know. It's all right, Anova." Maris's face was bruised and scraped, but a quick smile flickered across her face. "If I didn't want to get involved, I wouldn't have." Della laughed next to her. "Besides, it was worth it to see her so scared, and to be quit of her." She paused. "Away from Hinterfell." Della arched her eyebrow. "I don't know how you managed it, but I haven't seen you at the Rosebud to pay off your debts in a while." Maris glanced at Anova sideways. She completed Della's thought. Long enough to barely recognize her, as a matter of fact. The boundary forests were before them now. They'd made it through Urbas safely. Anova bit at her lower lip as she debated how to say it. There was no good way to admit to it. As they made it under the cover of the leaves, she said in a rush, "Some weeks ago, I killed the High King of Fae. It's why I need to go back there. Actually, my only hope of living was in this land, and I failed at that." Anova ignored the voice in her head. She had no other options right now. Hinterfell would hunt them as soon as they got inside Urbas, and Hellmyr might, too. The other two didn't say anything to that. Anova considered that there was no response fitting for it all. Her heart felt pinched in her chest. She'd failed at something else tonight, too. Juris wasn't ever there. The note she left for me was false. It was all a trap, Anova muttered. And I fell for it. It's also a sign that she can't find him either. Anova's gaze darted to Maris's face as she processed her words. Maris continued. If that's the only way the hag can hope to trick one of you, she's getting desperate. Anova swallowed. She hoped that was the case, and that Juris was well and away from her. She continued forward, even if all she wanted to do was run through the streets they used to stalk and call his name. But she couldn't. Not if she wanted him to live free from their enemies. I've become a walking target for no less than 4 parties. Hinterfell's men, the constables, the Fae who had turned on her, or even Hellmyr. By now, she had to assume they all knew she was in the city and likely were hunting her tracks even then. She stopped. They'd reached the point where she and her Fae guards had tethered their horses. Except there was only one left now. He chomped grass under the dim light of the dawn. There was no sign of the other 2 horses. They've been here already. Anova's palms became clammy. Maris was looking at her. What's wrong? There should be 3 here. She swallowed, though her mouth was dry. We should leave this area. It stank of a trap. We can't go back inside the city, Maris said. She'll have alerted the constables by now. Della stepped towards the horse. I'm not going back there. Anova got to work releasing the horse's tether. We won't, she assured them. Her heart thrummed out an erratic beat. She shouldn't load the horse with all 3 of them, but they had no other choice. She wasn't leaving one of them behind. Anova got on after Della, and Maris drove them forward in the front. Towards the boundary line, Anova called to her, and they started off at a lively gallop. The forest rushed past them, and Anova leaned into Della. She had no plan for her confrontation with Hellmyr. If he's even still there. Morning light streaked through the branches. Anova worked on keeping her breaths even. It hadn't all been a waste if she could just get these 2 out of Madame Hinterfell's clutches. Anova's head jerked up. Maris's voice rang through the trees. Who's there? So it wasn't just me. Shapes, things more shadow than anything else, moved among the trees near them. Her pulse galloped in time with their steed. Anova called out, Leave us! She'd traveled these forests more times than she cared to by now. She'd never seen something like this here. The shadows were getting closer to either side of them. Something in the back of Anova's skull buzzed. She whipped her gaze behind them. Someone's gaining on us, she said through the wind. Maris urged the horse faster, but Anova feared that it was too late. They were straining the horse too much already. The gallops of another horse reached her ears. They were almost caught up to them. Anova put one hand on the blood crown. Her teeth gritted together as a flicker of pain traveled down her nerve endings. Had the crown truly done that to Strago? Or had she? Does it matter? She closed her eyes. A voice shouted through the trees at her. Anova! Her eyes opened, and she saw someone she knew tailing them on horseback. I can't believe it. Alice's braided hair hit her back in regular thumps as she spurred her horse towards theirs. Her knapsack was strapped tight to her, which was fortunate because the 2 of them were nearly flying. Anova's voice was almost stolen by the wind. What are you doing here? When she caught up to them, she shouted to Anova. I'm coming with you. Her gaze burned into hers. We'll do it. Together. Anova felt like she was soaring too. With Alice, this might be possible. Alice threw another look at the 3 of them. But something chases you. We can go no faster, Maris said between her teeth up front. She had a horrible feeling in her stomach that this was related to the Fae guards who had turned on her in Urbess. They would all be hunted down because of her. Can you do anything? Anova asked the witch. She didn't spare time for an answer. Her horse veered away from there some distance ahead. A moment later, the sound of shattering glass filled the trees, and smoke snaked through the branches around them. Anova smiled despite the situation. This witch was proving to be infinitely useful. Anova held tight to Della, and the trees around them thinned to a sunlit break in the foliage. Anova's heart hammered in her chest. Hellmyr stopped his pacing. His guards were several steps away, or as far away as they could be without leaving. Their horse came to a dead stop in front of them. A moment later, Alice and her horse broke through the trees. She looked from her to the gathered Fae around them and froze. Hellmyr was beside her in a second, barely sparing the other humans around her a glance.
Will you mind telling me what in the hells was that?
Anova breathed. She had to handle this well if she was to convince him to bring along the others. Those two wanted the crown, she said with a flat voice. Your Kingsguard attacked me for it in Urbess. His expression changed at once. He put himself between her and the rest of the forest, his eyes scanning the trees around them. He'd noticed it too, then.
They came here with magic reserves so they could attack after moonfall.
His eyes lost their focus for a moment. His voice lowered to barely a murmur.
They knew. They were planning it.
Her stomach dropped. This wasn't good by any measure. Anova resisted, turning to look at the rest of his guard. How many more of them are traitors? He turned back to her again.
This doesn't change the fact that we can't get back to Fae now. We'll have to wait until the next moonrise.
She found she couldn't speak. No, Hinterfell is after me now too. We can't stay here. Hellmyr seemed to finally notice the other humans with her. One of his eyebrows arched.
Pets, my love? I thought you were beyond such things yourself.
His eyes brightened despite his seemingly sour mood.
Unless you mean them for me.
At once, Alice turned to him.
If this is to be how it is, you can kill me now, Fae.
Hellmyr smiled his hair-raising grin.
Humans like you are the easiest to drive mad.
He can't find out what she is, or what we're trying to do. Anova shoved herself between them before they started hurting each other with more than words. As your bride-to-be, I have chosen these three as my attendants and witnesses to our ceremony. They will be coming with us to Fae. He narrowed his eyes.
More humans.
He said it like a curse, but just for a second, he glanced out of his peripherals as if towards his guards. Perhaps he was thinking what she was thinking. How many more Fae will try to kill her? How many of them were in his guard right now? Hellmyr turned from them.
Just keep them out of the way.
She could feel the three humans staring at her for what she'd just said. Bride. Yes, I am to be the monster's bride. Alice approached her first. With a quick look to see that the Fae King was busy doling out orders, Anova mouthed to her. They can't know. Alice gave the smallest nod. They couldn't know they were sneaking in a witch to destroy the crown. Della's eyes were on the Fae as well, but Anova sensed her thoughts were bent in a different direction. Are we to stay here, then, until the night? Maris joined them. She recognized it, Anova. She'll know to come here. As always, Maris was right. She wasn't just losing a day by staying here. Surrounding her were potentially traitorous fae, Hellmyr, the last living witch, and Hinterfell's stolen property. There were too many things after them in the forest and city to stay in the same place for an entire day. She wasn't sure if a day was a short enough measure of time to start the human-fae war, but she didn't wish to find out. And besides, something told her that a day would be more than enough time when the blood crown was involved. Anova stifled a gasp before the others could look at her. That was the answer. Her stomach twisted into parts at the thought. But there was no other way. She approached the area where she could feel it in the air. It was nearly physical. The more she walked, the more pressure gathered in her chest until it was a choice of breathing or walking forward. Her hand reached towards it. That's where it is. Anova closed her eyes. None of the Fae were paying much attention to her or the other humans, which was exactly how she preferred it. How did it happen last time? Anova remembered the fear and anger of almost losing Maris and Della. She remembered the gleam shining off Hinterfell's hidden knife. Losing the crown was a bearable thing compared to that. She couldn't fail them. Not like how she failed her. I love you, little Nove. The feeling started in her aching skull and spiked from her palm before she could stop it. A burst of harsh light exploded from her touch just as soon as the pain burst from her too. The thought came an instant later. Last time I killed Strago. What if... It was the last thought she held on to before falling into the white abyss around her. Chapter 18. The white haze lingered around her brain for longer than she sensed that the explosion happened. Time passed, and she drifted. She felt her body being carried in the arms of another. He whispered in her ear, but the words were lost to her. She felt the rhythm of a horse underneath her. She felt when they left the lands that she'd been born in. When Anova opened her eyes, she was inside a tent. Her bed was too soft, but she dared not question it in case it reverted to stone. Her head ached dully. Alice was in the same room with her, sitting on a stool and scanning a book she must have brought with her. The witch's head jerked up. You're awake? Anova's head felt too heavy to speak, but she needed to know. How long? She said. How many days? She hated not knowing, though she hated the witch's answer more. 2 days, said Alice. Anova leaned back. They were well into Fae then, but to lose that much time when her days were so few was unforgivable. She clenched her fists. To save a day, she'd given up 2. Was it better that she'd gotten them inside Fae immediately, or would it have been better to keep her days as her own? What a fool you are. Her eyes stung, but she didn't want to cry. Not like this. She forced other words from her mouth because they had concerns besides that. Della and Maris, are they safe? Not only had she gambled away her time, but she'd left them alone with these creatures. Alice nodded, and Anova's head sank to her hands in relief. They are in the next tent. Alice paused before continuing. You're in luck. This is the first he's let you out of his sight. Anova looked up at the mention of Hellmyr. Had that been him carrying her? Or had that been a dream? An echo of that night she'd been poisoned by his father. Out loud, she asked, Where is he now? Sleeping. It's the first time since we've crossed into this place. Alice shook her head. I knew it would be at least this long before you woke, but of course I couldn't tell them that. Not that they would have believed me, anyway. They still don't know, then? Anova asked. Her heartbeat quickened. Keeping Alice's identity and skills a secret was the only way they would let her freely go. As long as the Fae thought of Alice as just a human girl, they were safe to investigate ways to destroy the Blood Crown, the object of every Fae's power-hungry dreams. Alice looked to the corners of the tent before answering. They don't suspect it. Not yet. Her eyes flashed back to her face. Though I've been slipping you some tonic of my own making when they haven't been looking, which is practically never, she muttered. Damned Fae. Anova closed her eyes. I did it then? I got us through the barrier, safely? The pause stretched on too long. She opened her eyes. At the witch's expression, Anova came to her feet. The world swirled around her, but she ignored it. Either it would stabilize or it wouldn't. What's wrong? Anova said. What happened? Alice seemed to choose her words carefully. You've done something like that before, haven't you? Anova swallowed. Once? Perhaps an hour or so before that? Alice looked away from her. It's killing you. Faster. Anova nearly fell on her face. She couldn't speak. Yes, I've known. Since we met. Alice was still looking at the floor when she spoke. Doing things like that is shortening your time. Her thoughts were like a windstorm in her mind, furious and consuming. But one thought broke through the rest. It must have been what changed her mind that night, Anova realized. Or a part of it. There was only one question she could force from her lips. How much? Anova said. How much shorter? Hours, seconds, days, Alice said and shook her head. I know not. She finally met her eyes. But using the magic inside it is not helping you, Anova. Of course it's not. Anova slipped a hand to her temple. She'd gambled more than she'd thought. She'd been using a cursed Fae artifact for its magic. What had she expected? She bit into her tongue and her eyelids pinched shut. She couldn't unravel. Not now, not for any reason. She had too far to go still. Her eyes snapped open. 2 days into Fae from the border, going straight from the boundary line towards Eastwoe. That would place this camp. She needed to get out of this Fae encampment. Now. There was someone she had to talk to again, and the forest where she resided should have been close to where they were now. Anova moved to where her bag and a new sword awaited her on top of a table. At least Hellmyr likes his women armed, she considered. Whether that was smart of him was another matter entirely. Can you keep them from discovering that I've woken? Just for a while longer. Perhaps another hour? Anova asked. Alice had been watching her. She nodded. With some scant supplies and a sword, Anova slipped through the back of the tent and into the sunlight outside. Despite the brightness, she wasn't overly concerned of Fae eyes catching her. This was when humans rose, not their kind. The lost forest should have been here. It was as if Anova had dreamt it up. She worried her lower lip. She wouldn't have been able to dream up Rietvar. Besides, he'd appeared outside the forest, hadn't he? But then, if only I've seen him, that's grounds for a hallucination, isn't it? Sunlight streamed through the trees. Every so often, Anova checked to see that her shadow still followed her. It was persistent, attached to her feet like shackles. The farther she went, the clearer it became. The forest didn't want to find her. She heard something behind her like the rustling of leaves when there should have been silence. Someone, or thing, was following her. Anova kept walking as if she hadn't noticed it yet. Better to get as much information and time to think as possible. From their steps, she judged them to be several paces behind her, close enough to track her, far away enough that most human ears wouldn't have detected it. However, she wasn't merely any human. Casually enough that it might have been called a reflex to an outside observer, Anova ran her thumb down the guard of her sheathed sword. On her other side, a sheathed knife hit softly against her hip bone. It didn't matter who it was, only that they were willing to kill her to get what sat on her head. A second after she heard their breath again, Anova pivoted on her heels. At the same time, she released from their sheaths her sword and the knife. As she spun, she threw the knife in a deadly arc towards her assailant. Just before it pierced his heart, he deflected it with his own blade. It was Leander. The breath was driven out of her. A pain spider-webbed from within Anova that had nothing to do with the blood crown. She lurched forward with her sword before her at a dangerous angle. Her blood pumped through her too quickly as it ran hot. She should have been fleeing before he killed her for the blood crown, but she needed to know a few things first. Leander raised his weapon in response, twisting to block her attack. Through gritted teeth, he said,
"What are you doing?"
"Attacking you first!" Anova rushed forward to land a blunt blow to his head. He dodged it by a few hairs. His dark eyes narrowed from behind his weapon.
"I don't wish to fight you, Anova. I want to talk."
They could do both. Anova didn't relent. A distracted opponent gave up more answers than he bargained for. Always. And she'd learned too well by now. Either the Fae manipulated you, or you them. "How long have you been following me?" Her question was accompanied by another lunge to his heart. There. It was a flicker of something in his eyes. He wanted to lie to her about this. Her heart throbbed faster. He'd been tailing her for much longer than she'd been out here looking for the lost forest. It was obvious that he hadn't just happened across her out in the Fae wild. Sweat trailed her spine. He'd been following Hellmyr's camp. For days, likely. Finally, he said,
"I had to see for myself."
Anova watched him from the other side of her blade. She paced around him, looking for the moment he'd give up his guard. "See what?" Even in the unbecoming sunlight, his eyes gleamed with the promise of darkness.
"Whether you were his captive or his conspirator."
The pain in her skull flared. What did he care what she did? It was time. She'd had enough of these answers. Any more of this and her anger would make her the fool here. She'd faint to his side and then run. She couldn't outrun a Fae, but her camp wasn't so far away for a sprint. Or so she hoped. "It seems you have your answer, don't you?" she said, aiming her sword for a swift and brutal strike. She needed him to believe that she would take the shot, and her body moved like she needed him dead. Before she could complete the motion, a cold tip hovered near the skin at her throat. The edge of her sword grazed his arm, and it drew a small flicker of blood which ran down the steel. She jerked into stillness before she cut herself on the point he held at her. Leander had seen through her feint. He pointed his blade straight at her jugular. But his eyes were elsewhere. They were cold, dark, calculating. He was looking at the ring on her hand.
"What is that?"
"What that is my own business." Anova forced the words out from some cold, pitiful place. "Why should it matter to you?" While carefully keeping the point of his blade at the same spot, Leander came closer to her. His eyes were an abyss that she didn't recognize.
"It becomes my business when you just hand him the crown on a gilded platter."
She wanted to punch him. It had never been about her. It had been about the crown. Always. Anova hated the low creature that was her heart. She wanted to rip it out of her. Leave me alone, Anova said through her teeth.
Are you so eager to hand the most power-hungry fae that?
Leander pointed his chin towards the crown. I'm not handing him anything, she snarled. He articulated each word with a sharp breath.
You're marrying him.
As if she didn't understand what it meant. As if she didn't understand the risks. This was what she did. But instead of pointing any of that out, she laughed, and it was a sudden, harsh thing. Are you jealous? She cut off the sound abruptly. Anova craned her neck to meet his stare. It's too late to pretend to care about that anymore, Faye. Leander pulled back his blade slowly.
Don't be ridiculous.
He snorted, though bitterness coated his voice when he spoke again.
I shouldn't have traded a thing to find you. I should have guessed that you weren't his prisoner. That this is all by your own volition.
Her heart felt as if it were being squeezed. She gnawed at the inside of her lip to keep moisture from gathering along her eyelids. Not in front of him, something inside her bade. You can unravel later. I don't need your help, Anova said.
That's been clear from the start.
His eyes narrowed on her. Then what are you doing here? At the same time, Anova ducked out of his reach. He didn't say anything. He didn't try to stop her either. Anova took another step away from him and towards her camp. I can do this myself. Before she could take another step, a noise in the tree branches above them made her freeze. Standing among a cloud of moths on a thick branch, her hair in ringlets around her face, was Lycasta. Leave the crown. Her head tilted and the sun hit the strands of her hair and turned them gold. You don't intend to use it, do you? Then we'll be the ones to destroy it. Anova felt her lips curl back to reveal her teeth. I'll be the one to do that. You haven't yet. Lycasta stared down at her with a flat expression. And yet it's been weeks, hasn't it? Unwillingly, Anova remembered the night she discovered that Lycasta and Leander were working together. It was the same night she'd seen them kiss. She held back the emotions warring to escape her throat. They would do her no good here, but the words slipped out of her anyway. Anova looked to Leander across from her. This is what you want? She asked. He stared back at her. What you really want? Of course this was what he wanted. It had been his goal to destroy the Blood Crown from the day the High King had slaughtered his family. But is that what you meant? She asked herself. Her heart tightened in her chest. He stood there, a thing of both her nightmares and daydreams. The skin that she'd once traced and kissed bathed in the filtered sunlight. The bare throat that she'd once buried herself against flickered with his heartbeat. The silence filled the air between them, heavy and resolute. Suddenly, she didn't want an answer anymore. Anova ran.